The stage when children grow up and leave their parents' home is always exciting. How will their life turn out? Will they be able to find the right path? How to protect an adult child from temptations and explain that not everything in this life needs to be tried? The saddest thing is that an adult child is unlikely to listen to their father or mother, especially when a person appears in their life who is ready to replace all loved ones at once. Jessie was born on September 10, 1988, in the family of Gary and Clara Bardwell, where her older brother Brandon was already growing up. Surprisingly, in childhood, the children were even confused. They were so similar, like reflections of each other. But if Brandon was mommy's favorite, then Jessie, from the first second of her appearance in the world, became daddy's girl. They say such a connection happens once in a lifetime. When Jessie was a baby, she did not let Gary pass. She followed him like a little tail, as if tied, and she always acted up if he did not take her in his arms. A world without a father simply did not exist for her. Her father was her universe. The idyll collapsed when Jessie turned 14 years old. Her parents divorced. The teenage period, already full of storms, became a test. At that moment, Jessie made the decision to stay with her father. The official version was that it was to not change schools and friends, but deep down, she simply could not imagine her daily life without Gary's presence. Everyone who knew Jessie described her as sociable, cheerful, freedom-loving, and independent girl, with a good sense of humor and a thirst for adventure, for which she was always ready to go to the ends of the earth. After graduating from high school, Jessie stepped into adult life by enrolling at the University of South Alabama and moving from her native state of Mississippi to sunny Orange Beach. There, she got a job at a popular beach restaurant, where she quickly became one of the team: ocean, sun, and new friends. And soon among her colleagues, there was that very guy who made her heart beat faster. From the outside, it seemed like an ideal life, but under the sound of the surf, Jessie often caught herself thinking that she desperately missed her dad's familiar voice and the familiar smell of home. She unbearably missed her family. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. One day, Jessie's friend, who managed the restaurant, learned that Gary Bardwell was a talented musician. She decided to invite him to perform at the restaurant. That was exactly how father and daughter found themselves together again. When the man came, they went boating and fishing together. The girl was always present at her father's concerts. They were not just relatives, they were best friends. When the man left, Jessie continued to maintain close contact with him. Not a day passed without Gary receiving a message from his little girl. She called and wrote to him constantly. Despite the distance, father and daughter remained very close. At the end of December 2015, something unexpected happened. Jessie made a decision. She suddenly dropped everything and moved more than 1,000 kilometers to the city of Richardson in the state of Texas. Of course, it was surprising. The girl did not tell anyone about her plans. It seemed she was living a calm life in Alabama, working as a waitress and dating a guy. But then she suddenly decided to completely change her life. She broke up with the guy, quit her job, and went to Texas. Later, it turned out that Jessie's spontaneous decision still had a reason. That reason was named Jason Lowe. Jason was 28 years old. He had 2 higher educations. He was smart, charming, and worked in the high-tech field in a company in Dallas. His new job required a move, and Jessie decided to follow him because she was madly in love. For the girl, these were not just new relationships. It was a ticket to a more exciting life. Jessie dreamed of building a career in the field of cosmetology, and moving to Texas gave her such an opportunity. In the new city, the young people quickly settled in. They rented an apartment together and began a new life. This whole move was not at all in Jessie's character. It was too spontaneous. She did not discuss it with her friends or with her family, although she usually maintained constant contact with them. She just took off and left. The strangest thing was that after moving to Texas, communication with her parents, including her father, sharply decreased. Jessie no longer called and did not write to Gary every day as before. Everything changed very much as soon as she got a new boyfriend, Jason Lowe. Jessie not only stopped calling, she herself answered calls less and less often. Her phone was often turned off. The girl who used to always be on her phone suddenly stopped getting in touch. One day, Jesse's father decided to visit his daughter in Texas. It was at that moment that he first met her boyfriend, Jason. Gary, possibly like any worried father, immediately had a bad feeling. His daughter's new boyfriend seemed too arrogant and narcissistic to him. In addition, Lowe was an inveterate liar. For example, he claimed that he had served in the Navy and had been a Navy SEAL. But this was clearly a lie. Gary intuitively felt that Jason was not who he claimed to be, so he treated him with caution. The whole situation worsened when, a month after the move, in early 2016, Jessie called her father and said that Jason had kicked her out of the apartment. The young people had allegedly quarreled, and the guy accused the girl of cheating and being pregnant by another man. Jessie, in despair and tears, called her father. Gary immediately bought her a plane ticket so she could return to Mississippi. That night, Jessie decided to spend the night at her friend's house, but in the end, she never returned home because at the last moment, she reconciled with Jason and stayed with him in Texas. The girl explained to her father that the guy regretted the quarrel and she would try to trust him again. She was 27 years old. She was an adult woman, so Gary Bardwell, with a heavy heart, resigned himself. But later, the man often scolded himself for this decision. In February 2016, Jessie went to the hospital and had an abortion. After this incident, she finally distanced herself from her family, began to call less often, and did not answer messages. It got to the point where the parents first had to contact Jason to talk to Jessie. The guy always answered calls, but at the same time came up with excuses why Jessie could not come to the phone. He showed all his talent as a liar. In fact, Lowe behaved like a real tyrant. In general, these were clearly unhealthy relationships. Gary tried to convince his daughter of this and urged her to return home, but the love-struck Jessie did not listen to him. Once the couple visited Jessie's parents in Mississippi, hugging his daughter goodbye, Gary Bardwell did not yet know that he was seeing her for the last time. A couple of months later, in early May 2016, Jessie's family realized that they had not received any news from her for a long time. If earlier she called and wrote less and less often, now the connection with her was completely cut off. At some point, the parents simply stopped receiving any news from their adult daughter. When Mother's Day came on May 8th, 2016, the anxiety increased. Jessie did not call and did not congratulate her parents. Moreover, she herself did not pick up the phone. This was very unlike Jessie, and it was then that the parents sounded the alarm. First, Gary himself tried to contact his daughter, but Jason picked up the phone. When asked where Jessie was, he replied that she had gone somewhere and had not yet returned. During the conversation, Jason unexpectedly got angry, saying that Jessie was an adult and free to do whatever she wanted. His girlfriend was not at all obliged to report her behavior to her father. Stunned by such impudence, Gary got into his car and set off on a long journey to Richardson, Texas. In the apartment where Jason and Jessie lived, his daughter was not there. His inner feeling told Gary that something had happened. In addition, the day before he had a nightmare that Jessie had been killed. The man woke up in a cold sweat, calming himself that it was just a dream. But somewhere deep inside, he felt that his girl might no longer be in this world. Shaking off the dark thoughts, Gary Bardwell contacted the Richardson police and reported Jessie's disappearance. Law enforcement officers immediately began searching and went to the apartment to talk to Jason Lowe. The young man assured them that Jessie had gone shopping and would be back soon. Over the next 24 hours, the police repeatedly came to the apartment, but Jessie never appeared there. The investigators pressed the guy, and he stated that it turned out he had not seen her since May 8th, since Mother's Day. According to Lowe, Jessie had allegedly left in her Acura SUV, and since then, he had not seen her and had heard nothing about her. Jason pretended that he himself was confused about where his girlfriend could have gone. The police quickly found out that this was a lie, since 3 weeks before the disappearance, the couple had sold the car that Jessie had allegedly left in. But why did Lowe lie about such details? During the conversation with Jason, the police examined his apartment and noticed several suspicious details. Traces of white powder were found on the countertop. When asked to inspect the garage, Lowe agreed reluctantly. But it was there that the officers smelled a terrible odor, which they described as the smell of death. Everywhere there were cans of air freshener, with which someone had clearly tried to mask the stench. But it was so strong that the fresheners could not cope with their task. The same was true for Jason's car. In the cabin of his black Audi, there was an unbearable smell. The car itself, as it turned out, was in a deplorable condition. The front bumper was torn off and lay in the trunk, and the body of the car was covered with a layer of dirt. At that moment, the detectives were almost sure that decomposing remains of a dead person had been transported in the Audi. To confirm their suspicions, the police conducted a test using luminol, and after spraying the substance, the entire space lit up like a Christmas tree, especially in the trunk. It was obvious that someone's blood had recently been spilled there. The professional liar, Jason, tried to explain the dirt and damage on the car by saying that he had been searching for his girlfriend around the area, and during this had hit a hole in the road. However, the results of the luminol test and other evidence, such as the dark liquid on the floor in the garage that turned out to be blood, further convinced the detectives of his involvement in Jesse's disappearance. Despite the fact that the young girl had still not been found, the missing person case already looked more like a case of violent death. Meanwhile, Jason Lowe was arrested on charges of possession of prohibited substances found on the table in the apartment. All night, the detectives tried to find out from the guy about Jessie, about her whereabouts, but he stubbornly refused to cooperate. It seemed that Jason was not at all worried that his girlfriend was missing. He directly told the police that he was not going to confess to something he had not done. When Lowe was asked about the bloodstains in the car and garage, he remained silent. After thinking a little, the guy said that he did not understand what the police were talking about. Nevertheless, Jason was charged with murder. The evidence indicated that Jessie was probably dead, and Jason most likely had involvement in her death. The most difficult thing was to find the body. Gradually, the investigators began the search, but they understood that it would be difficult. Texas is a huge state. There are many rivers, many lakes, a lot of ponds and fields. In Texas, there are millions of places where remains can be hidden, and Jesse's body could be anywhere. All this time, Jason was in custody, and at some point, his friend Thomas Jordan decided to visit him. Before her disappearance, Jessie, together with her boyfriend, had been house-sitting for Thomas and his partner Regina while they were out of town. The Jordans had met Jessie and Jason not so long ago, but quickly became attached to the loving couple. One could say they took them under their wing, like their own children. The spouses left the city on May 1st, leaving the house and the dog in the care of their new friends. When the married couple returned, everything was as usual, but then the Jordans heard shocking news. It turned out that Jason had been arrested for the murder of Jessie, and that was exactly why Thomas came to Jason in prison and demanded the truth from him. The man wanted to know if anything had happened in the house during their absence. At that moment, something strange happened. Lowe decided for the first time to confess that Jessie was really dead. He said that he was nearby when she was dying, but allegedly did not cause her any harm. In his opinion, it was an accident, and the most he could be accused of was criminal negligence. After that, Jason Lowe tried to make a deal with the police and the prosecutor's office. He knew that all the evidence was against him and he faced a long term. The young man decided to get ahead of events, make his life easier, and get a lighter sentence. He promised to tell where to look for the girl's body, if, of course, they agreed not to sentence him to life imprisonment, giving him the right to atone for his guilt and be released a little later. In Texas, life imprisonment can reach 99 years. With the deal, the maximum term would be half as much, 50 years. Nevertheless, the prosecutors agreed to the deal because they wanted to find Jessie Bardwell's body and later hand it over to the family. The parents should at least somehow say goodbye to their daughter and properly see her off on her last journey. On May 19th, 2016, approximately 3 weeks after the girl's disappearance, after concluding the deal with the authorities, Jason directed the police to a remote ranch in Farmersville, located approximately 60 kilometers from Richardson. He said that somewhere there in the field, they would find this. That was exactly how he referred to Jessie's body, which sounded cold and cruel. The The police arrived at the indicated place and soon noticed tire tracks on the muddy ground in the field where Jason had obviously gotten stuck in his car. They also found several car parts that he had damaged when the Audi was slipping in the clay. Then, at the edge of the field, the police noticed a large sheet of iron that was clearly covering something. There rested the body of 27-year-old Jessie. She was wrapped in sheets, a towel, bubble wrap, and garbage bags. Later, it turned out that the sheets and towel had been taken from the house that the couple had been watching during the owner's absence. The house belonged to Thomas Jordan, the same man who had come to him in prison. By the time of discovery, Jessie's body was in a stage of severe decomposition. Obviously, she had been dead for several weeks already. After the autopsy, the coroner was unable to determine the exact cause of death due to the deplorable condition of the remains. Thus, it was unknown how Jessie had died, but her death was ruled a homicide. The parents of the deceased girl were not immediately told that the location of the corpse had been indicated by Jessie's boyfriend himself. But when they learned about it, they were overcome with hatred toward the young man. This man had destroyed their family's life to the ground. Months passed after Jessie's death. The grief-stricken father struggled with anger and the desire for revenge. All this time, only one thought supported him: to wait until Jason Lowe appeared before the judge and the jury in the courtroom and was found guilty of the monstrous crime. To let off steam, the father, driven mad by grief, Gary Bardwell, took a heavy sledgehammer and dragged a stump to the house. Then he printed out photographs of his daughter's boyfriend, placed them on the stump, and beat them until he was exhausted and burst into tears, giving vent to his emotions. His little girl, his only daughter, whom he would never be able to hug again, she had left this world forever. The trial of Jason Lowe began in September 2017, a year after Jessie's death. He did not plead guilty to murder, still insisting on an accident. During the investigation, it turned out that Lowe had begun using prohibited substances from the age of 13, despite growing up in a wealthy family. The man continued to take drugs until recently. The lawyer assured that in fact Jason loved Jessie Bardwell. The guy had planned a future with her and did not intend to cause her pain. He wanted to marry this girl, buy a house, and have children. But then, he simply took her life. Delving into Jason Lowe's past, the police discovered that in reality, this man had no idea what love and care were. It turned out that before his relationship with Jessie, the guy had had 2 girlfriends whom he treated very harshly. The man was a manipulator, a terrible jealous person, and often lost his temper. Jason Lowe had always been prone to violence and tried to control his partners. During the investigation, Jason admitted that he had been present at the moment of Jessie's death. He was there, but in no way did he take her life. His girlfriend's death was accidental. The full version of his events sounded as follows. The evening of May 1st, 2016 in Richardson was stuffy. Jason and Jessie settled in the living room in the house of their friends the Jordans. The mood was playful and light. They wanted adventure. Jason took out a prohibited substance he had bought in advance. The young people decided not to complicate things. They mixed the powder with orange juice in plastic cups. The sweet and sour taste drowned out the bitterness. After some time, the room began to swim, the world became brighter, and desires sharper. After consuming the mixture, the couple retired to the bathroom and made love. At some point, when the passion reached its peak, Jason slipped on the wet floor. His leg went to the side, and he instinctively jerked, trying to keep his balance. But instead, he pushed his girlfriend. Jessie lost her footing, and with a dull, heavy thud, fell to the floor, hitting her head first on the faucet and then on the edge of the bathtub. Jessie screamed more from surprise than from pain. Blood appeared on the back of her head, just above the neck, a small cut that immediately began to sting. Jason helped her get up. Her head was spinning, her skin was burning as if it was baking from the inside. At that moment, the girl felt unwell. Jason moistened a towel and applied it to the wound. The bleeding stopped quickly. The cut turned out to be minor. Jessie yawned, her eyelids grew heavy, and the drugged couple decided that sleep was supposedly the best healer. The lovers left the bathroom and collapsed into bed. Jessie snuggled up to Jason, placing her head on his chest. He stroked her hair, listened as her breathing became even, and he himself did not notice how he fell into darkness. Morning burst into Jason's consciousness, not with light, but with sounds. Somewhere, a dog was barking desperately. Someone was persistently banging on the door, so loudly that the glass vibrated. After the stormy night, Lowe barely opened his eyes. Jesse was still lying on his chest, not moving. He tried to wake her, but she did not react. Jason sat up in bed, and Jesse's head rolled limply onto the pillow. Her eyes were closed, and her mouth was slightly open. He shook her by the shoulder again. Her head swung from side to side like a rag doll. A cold horror crawled from the back of his head down his spine. Jason put his fingers to her neck in search of a pulse, but felt nothing except the beating of his own heart, ready to jump out of his chest. At that moment, Lowe realized that, most likely, Jesse had died in her sleep from a traumatic brain injury received as a result of the fall and hitting her head the day before. Instead of grabbing the phone and dialing 911, instead of performing artificial respiration and trying to save his girlfriend, he simply froze. Panic twisted his stomach into a knot, while the knocking on the door continued. Finally, Jason came to his senses, got up, pulled on his jeans, and went to open the door. On the threshold stood Robert Gwynn, the drug supplier, the very person from whom Lowe regularly bought goods. When Jason told him about Jesse's death, Gwynn pushed him aside with his shoulder and went into the bedroom. Seeing the girl without signs of life, he whistled and also tried to bring her to her senses, but unsuccessfully. A heavy, sticky silence hung in the air, and the drug supplier was the first to break it. The fear in his eyes was replaced by cold calculation. After all, if the body was found, the autopsy would show traces of illegal substances, the very ones he sold, and then he would definitely face a term. According to Lowe, it was Gwynn who suggested hiding the body to avoid problems in the future. After thinking a little, the men together wrapped Jessie in a sheet and placed her in the trunk of Jason's Audi. Gwynn ordered the body to be hidden on a nearby farm, but Lowe simply left it in the car, in the garage near his apartment. Thus, the girl's decomposing remains lay in the car for 8 days, until the family began asking Jason questions about his daughter's whereabouts. The parents really began to worry about her on May 8th, on Mother's Day, when she did not get in touch. It was then that Jason realized that he finally needed to somehow get rid of the corpse. Lowe went to the remote rural area of Farmersville and left Jesse's body there, covering it with a huge piece of metal. The remains were discovered only 10 days later. Severe decomposition did not allow the medical examiner to establish the exact cause of death, and now the defense claimed that Jesse's death was an accident. According to the defenders, Jason was a friendly and nice guy. He himself was very traumatized by the death of his beloved girl. However, Jason's further behavior immediately after Jesse's death spoke to the contrary. While Jesse's dead body was decomposing in the trunk of his car, the authorities discovered that Lowe had been texting other women on the internet and also sending them photographs of his genitals. The man was in his apartment and at that time was flirting in correspondence with others. Of course, Lowe felt absolutely no guilt, and this emphasized his painful and perverted nature. Jason also continued correspondence with Jessie from her phone for several days after her death, in order to create the illusion that she was still alive. When the trial came to an end, the jury delivered a guilty verdict, not believing the story about the accident, and found Jason guilty of the death of 27-year-old Jessie Bardwell. Under the deal, the judge sentenced Lowe to 50 years in prison, with the condition that he serve at least half of that term before he could apply for parole. Despite the fact that Jason did not receive the maximum term, he remains in prison to this day and continues to insist on his innocence. After the death of his beloved daughter Jessie, Gary Bardwell, who is a talented musician, wrote a song wishing to preserve the bright memory of his daughter. Meanwhile, Jason Lowe is already fully preparing to be released from prison. The guy continues to correspond with other girls. The only question is whether such justice can protect Lowe's new acquaintances from new tragedies. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. Dave Cave lived in the city of Escondido with his fiancée, Carrie, and her 14-year-old daughter, Amber Dubois. The teenage girl was at the age that is commonly called transitional. In Dave's eyes, Amber was quite the rebel. The girl did not recognize any rules, violated all boundaries of what was allowed, and constantly argued with her stepfather. Dave was never an authority figure for her. He was a stranger who had invaded their world with her mother and was trying to dictate his own terms. Among her friends, Amber was an ordinary high school student. She loved meeting with her girlfriends and read a lot. The girl was not a spoiled teenager. She studied well in school and had not even started using makeup yet. The thing was that her parents' divorce had been hard on her, and the appearance of another man in her mother's life meant that everything would now change. The man who had taken on the role of stepfather never overstepped the mark in raising his stepdaughter. He simply asked her to help her mother, at least somehow, and to listen to his opinion. But even these minimal requirements infuriated Amber. It got to the point where the girl simply began to ignore her stepfather. The confrontation lasted more than a month. As soon as Dave opened his mouth, the schoolgirl would demonstratively plug her ears and leave the room. But one day in February, something clicked. Amber suddenly sat down next to Dave herself and suggested they talk. That evening, the stepfather and stepdaughter expressed to each other the accumulated grievances and dissatisfactions. As a result, they decided to start everything from a clean slate. As a gesture of reconciliation, Dave even invited Amber to take a walk at the shopping mall. The man and his stepdaughter bought a bunch of clothes, books, and even a couple of cute trinkets. They returned home pleased and happy. For the first time in a long time, Dave and Amber felt like a real family. By the end of the quarter at school, Amber had a class project called Future Farmers of America. The city of Escondido was located in a valley and was hidden from the outside world by the surrounding hills. Originally, the settlement had been formed as an agricultural center. It was common for the city's residents to have domestic animals. Children from school age were also taught to engage in raising livestock. Amber had always dreamed of a pet, and as part of the school course, students were offered to take care of lambs. All they had to do was bring a check to school, and then the children could take home the animal they liked. Grades were given for how the children cared for the pet, how they brushed it, fed it, and monitored its health. But the most important thing was that the lamb would stay with them forever. Upon learning this joyful news, Amber hurried home. She enthusiastically told her parents about the school project and looked at them pleadingly. And they did not have to be persuaded for long. The man wanted to strengthen the fragile relationship between him and his stepdaughter that had only recently begun to form. He easily agreed to cover the expenses. He said he would write a check so that Amber could have her own lamb. The girl smiled happily and even hugged her stepfather. She really appreciated his care. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Early in the morning, on February 13th, she came to Dave for the money. Her stepfather wrote her a check and left for the gym. When he returned, Amber was already not at home. Usually, when classes ended, Amber went straight home. The school was just a couple of steps away, and the student did not need to adjust to the school bus. But today, Amber was delayed for some reason. At first, the parents were not worried. The girl could have chatted with her friends or been running around with her lamb, losing track of time. Later, Dave still called the school just to find out if Amber's classes had ended, and here he was stunned. The thing was that the girl had not appeared in class at all. Of course, Amber was a teenager with character, but not to the point of skipping school without any reason. At home, she could be capricious, but she had always been responsible about her studies. Especially today, they were supposed to bring the lambs. The parents immediately realized that something was wrong and hurried to the police. Fortunately, the police officers did not brush them off and immediately accepted the report. They immediately began large-scale searches. The officers went around the neighbors, talked with the missing schoolgirl's friends, and requested phone call records from the operator. Carrie and Dave also did not sit idle. They drove along Amber's route to school, put up flyers around the city, and went around all the houses in the area. In the following days, more than 400 volunteers searched on foot an area of 500 square kilometers. Then, the police came across something really suspicious. Amber had a flip phone. All this time, while she was being searched for, the mobile phone had been turned off. But at some point, the phone turned on for just a few seconds. Someone checked the voicemail and immediately turned it off again. The question arose, who was it? Amber, who was hiding and had deliberately turned off the phone so she would not be found? Or had someone kidnapped the girl and was now monitoring the schoolgirl's calls? The police were completely at a loss. One thing was clear. The girl had not simply gone for a walk. It was either a runaway from home or a real crime. First of all, the police officers decided to work on the worst-case scenario. Could someone have really harmed Amber? And most importantly, for what purpose? It was at this point that the police officers' attention fell on Amber's stepfather, Dave. According to witnesses, the man had been acting strangely. In the morning, Dave had left the house very early to work out at the gym. This was normal, as he often did workouts before work. But that day, instead of going to the office from the gym, Dave drove home. The man explained that he had deliberately taken the day off, supposedly to work on tax returns. But before, Dave had never in his life brought paperwork home. He had done it for the first time on the very day his stepdaughter disappeared. And that was strange. There was one more but. During the day, Dave visited Carrie, Amber's mom, at work. He bought flowers and chocolate-covered strawberries. The man wanted to make a surprise for Valentine's Day. However, the calendar showed February 13th. Dave, who could not stand holidays and usually pretended that Valentine's Day did not exist at all, suddenly started playing the romantic. To say that Carrie was surprised would be an understatement. She was simply shocked by the unexpected surprise. None of this matched the image of her partner. Even stranger was the fact that afterward, Dave sat down at her desk and chatted about all sorts of nonsense. Carrie repeatedly hinted to him that it was time for her to get back to work, but the man seemed not to hear. 45 minutes passed before she pushed him out the door. Now a bunch of questions arose. Why had Dave Cave suddenly become romantic and caring? Did the man need to confirm his alibi? Was he watching Carrie's reaction? Was he somehow involved in the disappearance of his 14-year-old stepdaughter? The teachers at the school where Amber studied noticed that day that the girl was not in class. They decided that she was sick and called home to inquire about her well-being. At that moment, no one answered the phone. By that time, Dave had already returned from the gym. According to him, he had been home alone. Then why had no one answered the call from the school? After learning about all these details, the police asked Dave directly where he had been that day and why he had not answered the call if he was at home. The man just shrugged. He could not explain why he had not heard the phone. Despite the fact that the story turned out to be confusing and raised a lot of suspicions, there was not a single concrete piece of evidence. For lack of evidence, the police could not arrest Amber's stepfather, but everyone around, including the mother of the missing schoolgirl, began to doubt his honesty. Carrie could no longer lie in the same bed with a man who was suspected of a crime, and not just of breaking the law, but of kidnapping her only daughter. Dave categorically denied any involvement in Amber's disappearance, but Carrie could not get rid of her doubts. 6 weeks after Amber disappeared, the woman broke up with Dave and moved out of his house. She did not believe that Dave could have planned the crime in advance, but she allowed for the possibility that her teenage daughter could have somehow provoked the man with her behavior. And living with a person you suspect is simply impossible. Dave passed a lie detector test 8 times. The polygraph results indicated that he was not lying. Nevertheless, in the following months, every step Dave took was accompanied by close public scrutiny. The problem was that no one knew for sure what had happened to 14-year-old Amber Dubois. No one knew the truth. If Dave was really guilty, it meant he had fooled everyone and gotten away with it. And if he was innocent, then his life had been shattered to pieces, and all because of one strange day and one unanswered phone call. 6 months after Amber's disappearance, in August 2009, the schoolgirl's family hired a canine team to search for a person by scent. The dogs led the specialists to a highway in a remote area near an Indian village. Further, the trail was lost. The animals ran near the road, sniffing the air. But the body was never found. Carrie did not lose hope that her daughter was still alive. Almost a year passed, and the Amber Dubois case was still unsolved. And then another girl disappeared. On February 25, 2010, the police were informed that 17-year-old Chelsea King had gone for a run and had not returned. Her car was found not far from a local hiking trail in a public park in San Diego, California. The schoolgirl had last been seen near the lake. The lake was only 16 kilometers from Amber's house. It was just a few minutes by car. Chelsea King, like Amber, attended high school. An ordinary girl, she was a member of the Youth Symphony Orchestra. Her report card was all A's. A diligent student, she planned to go to college in the future, but fate decided otherwise. Amber Dubois' family, along with hundreds of volunteers, joined the search for Chelsea. They printed flyers and posted them around the city. Just as a year earlier, Carrie had searched for her own daughter. The woman still believed to the last that Amber would return home alive and unharmed. In the meantime, Carrie wanted to help search for another schoolgirl. At first, the police did not connect the two cases. The girls were not relatives, did not know each other, and had never even communicated. There was a high probability that they did not know of each other's existence at all. However, local residents became alarmed. In their quiet, peaceful area, something unusual rarely happened. But suddenly, in 1 year, 2 missing teenagers. It was too much of a coincidence. This circumstance caused many to suspect that both girls had become victims of the same criminal. The police also began to think about it. And when they began searching for Chelsea King, they also checked whether there would be a connection to Amber's case. One day, a search team was combing the grass along the path where Chelsea usually ran. And very close to the trail, they discovered a sock and women's underwear. The items were shown to Chelsea's parents. Her mother confirmed that these were Chelsea's things. Analysis of the DNA particles found on the underwear showed a match. The DNA belonged to a man listed in the National Registry of Persons who had committed sex crimes. The man's name was John Gardner. At the time of Chelsea King's disappearance in 2010, he was 31 years old. John Gardner was born in 1979. He grew up in California. From childhood, it was clear that something was wrong with the boy. He was not a bad child. He was simply different from most. His father regularly punished little John, yelled at him, put him in the corner, and periodically reached for the belt. Then his parents divorced. The boy's further upbringing was handled by his stepfather. Unlike his biological father, the man did not offend his stepson, but the good attitude of his sister and parents had no effect on the child's behavior at school. In class, John could not sit still for long. When the teacher was explaining a new topic, he could easily stand up in the middle of the lesson and start shouting something. He always wanted to be the center of attention. At his desk, John fidgeted and interfered with everyone else. The teachers were puzzled. The guy was clearly not stupid, but he did not want to study and did not let others do so. At the insistence of the teachers, the parents took John to a doctor to assess his learning abilities. That doctor sent him to another specialist, then to a third. The doctors threw up their hands. The diagnoses changed like gloves. The medications either did not help or only made things worse. In general, medicine was unable to identify the problem and prescribe the correct treatment. By high school, John's behavior had changed even more for the worse, and after graduation, Gardner's life completely went downhill. He did not go to college, but he got a college girlfriend. Every day, waiting for her after classes, John would hang around the campus for hours. Although the rules prohibited outsiders from being on college grounds, Gardner was not particularly interested in that. He never followed other people's rules and did whatever came into his head. One day, the girl got tired of receiving remarks from the teachers, and she dumped the clingy boyfriend. He continued to walk around, wait for her near the dormitory, and annoy everyone around with his presence. The school administration had to call the police, and as a result, John was arrested for the first time. In 2000, when John was 20 years old, he invited his neighbor Kelly over. The guy suggested they watch a movie together. He warned her that he liked her, but only as a friend. Kelly was a 13-year-old teenager. She did not doubt the young man's words. John lived next door and caused no concern at all, but as soon as they were alone, the guy seemed to snap. He attacked Kelly and tried to undress her. The girl was seriously frightened. Compared to her, John looked like a big, strong man whom it was not so easy to handle. The only thing she could do was try to run away. But Gardner, heated with desire, did not want to let go of his prey. The girl's screams finally drove him out of his mind. John grabbed her by the blouse, blocked her path, and began to beat her. It is unknown how it all could have ended, but at some point, John seemed to come to his senses. He stopped swinging his fists, apologized, and let Kelly go home. These sharp changes in Gardner frightened the girl even more. It was as if two different people were in one body. All in tears and bruises, Kelly rushed home. She told her parents what had happened to her. The girl's father immediately called the police, and soon the investigation began. During interrogation, John Gardner stubbornly insisted on his innocence. He stated that Kelly was too young for him. They had simply watched a movie, and the girl had gone home. He had no idea where the bruises on her body had come from. Of course, to everyone the story sounded fake. To everyone except John. He so sincerely believed in his stories, as if he really did not remember beating Kelly. However, the evidence against the guy was indisputable. Gardner was charged with molesting a minor. He made a deal with the prosecution and still admitted his guilt. For this, his sentence was reduced. Instead of the presumed 11 years in prison, he was sentenced to only 6. Previously, the young man had no criminal record, and the court took this into account as a mitigating circumstance. As a result, John spent 5 years behind bars. He was released in 2006 on parole. For Gardner, the prisoner rehabilitation program was nothing more than a way to get out of prison. Psychologists working with convicted criminals realized that John was not going to change and was simply looking for a way to break free. Despite this, the guy was released from prison a year early. When in 2006 Gardner finally left the prison walls, he continued to break the law. They had given him a chance, and he simply trampled on it. John was placed under house arrest. He was supposed to stay at home and wear an electronic ankle bracelet. But the man learned how to disable the device and freely walk the streets. He bought weapons and prohibited drugs, wandered near children's institutions, which was strictly forbidden to him, and even settled near a school. The wildest thing was that those who were supposed to monitor him pretended not to notice anything. Probation officers turned a blind eye, and the police did not react. The authorities seemed not to see any real threat to society in him. According to court documents, during the time he wore the bracelet, he committed a total of 168 violations of the conditions of his early release. Now that Gardner's DNA had been found on the belongings of the missing Chelsea King, the investigators reviewed the court documents. They saw that the man had previously attacked schoolgirls, beaten them, stalked them, and tried to force them into intimacy. If John really had something to do with the disappearance of the high school student, then was it not because of him that the other schoolgirl, Amber Dubois, had gone missing? Both girls had disappeared in the same area under unclear circumstances. The detectives decided to check everything again. They reopened old cases, reread all the statements and complaints that had come from this area over the past few years, since the time John had been released from prison. That was how the detectives came across 22-year-old Candace Moncayo. On December 27, 2009, 2 months before 14-year-old Amber disappeared, Candace had filed a report with the police. One morning, the girl had gone for her usual run, covered 13 kilometers, got tired, and decided to relax a bit. It was at that moment that an unknown man approached her. Candace did not understand at all what he wanted. The girl greeted him out of politeness, but instead of greeting her back, he attacked her, knocked her to the ground, and began to pull up her shirt. The stranger's touches made the athlete remember everything her father had taught her. Candace's father was a well-known professional kickboxer. From a young age, he had trained his daughter in self-defense techniques and explained how to act in case of an attack. As it turned out, the effects of the training had not been in vain. Of course, Candace was scared when she found herself in the arms of a maniac, but the girl did not panic. She managed to swing and punch the attacker right in the nose. While he was wiping the bloody snot, she rushed straight to the police station for help. Unfortunately, the man was not found at the time. The description was too vague. Candace had no time to examine the attacker's face. She needed to get away as quickly as possible. But now, the detectives had a specific man, John Gardner. They invited Candace to the police station and showed her a photograph. she confirmed that it was him. In the girl's head at that hour was that terrible episode. There could be no mistake. It was Gardner whose nose she had broken when he tried to take her. Later, the investigators discovered another find. They searched the area where Gardner had attacked Candace and came across the remains of 17-year-old Chelsea King. It is unlikely her body would have been found so quickly if nature and wild animals had not helped. The girl's corpse lay in a shallow pit, covered with leaves, branches, and earth. Chelsea King had been killed. The evidence indicated that John Gardner was the perpetrator. It was him whom the high school student had met on her run, and that meeting turned out to be fatal. Later, Gardner confessed in court that he had attacked her and dragged her to a secluded place. First, he raped her, and then he strangled her. He buried the girl in a shallow grave on the shore of the lake. By that time, Amber Dubois' fate still remained a mystery to the police. Her body had not been found. It was unclear whether anything had happened to her at all, or whether the teenage girl had simply run away from home. Only Gardner himself could answer these questions. The detectives decided to use a trick. California. Law provided for the death penalty for the crimes committed by John. He was offered a choice: cooperation with the authorities and life imprisonment, or the death penalty for the murder of Chelsea King and the attack on Candace Moncayo. All he had to do was confess to the kidnapping of Amber and show where her remains were. If the girl was no longer alive, it was important for the authorities to return her body to her parents. The grief-stricken mother and father needed at least to say goodbye to their daughter and bury her properly. The criminal thought it over, weighed the risks, and agreed. The man confessed that Amber's body had been buried in a remote area near the district where an Indian tribe lived. The police went to the indicated site and organized a search. Soon, human bones were indeed discovered. By that time, almost nothing remained of the body. Even some parts of the skeleton were missing. Apparently, wild animals had reached the remains and dragged them around the area. Dental examination confirmed Gardner's words. Everything matched. It was 14-year-old Amber Dubois. On Friday, February 13, 2009, Gardner was driving down the street in his car. That day, he had no specific plans. His mood was terrible. His personal life was not working out at all. Every day lived was like the previous one. Out of boredom, the man was turning his head from side to side and suddenly saw Amber. The girl was literally glowing with happiness. Amber was already imagining how she would bring home a little lamb that evening. Amber interested John. He carefully looked around. There were residential houses nearby. If the teenager had screamed, someone would surely have heard. To avoid unnecessary witnesses, the schoolgirl needed to be intimidated. John stopped near the girl, pointed a gun in her face, and ordered her to get into the car immediately. Gardner saw the smile slide off her face and her hands begin to shake. Frightened by the weapon, Amber obediently sat down in the passenger seat. John turned on the radio, deciding that cheerful music would help her calm down. By that time, the criminal had not yet decided what he would do with the girl. He turned around and drove toward the Indian village. Already there, in the remote area, a wild desire came over him. After raping Amber, Gardner pulled out a knife and inflicted several fatal stab wounds. Initially, the man had not planned to attack her, much less kill her. He wanted to let the schoolgirl go, hoping she would not tell her parents. But at some point, he suddenly wanted to pull out the knife and watch Amber's eyes go out forever. When Gardner confessed, it became clear to everyone that Amber's stepfather Dave had absolutely nothing to do with his stepdaughter's disappearance. His strange behavior that day could not be explained. The man had indeed broken his usual daily routine and had not gone to work. He had shown up at Carrie's with gifts on the eve of Valentine's Day and had not heard the call from the school, even though he was at home. In reality, the man had also been inspired by the reconciliation with his stepdaughter. That was exactly why he had behaved a little strangely. He had simply felt happiness in the moment. However, this no longer mattered. Dave was innocent, and all this time he had been telling the truth. As it turned out, the man had done nothing bad to his stepdaughter. He had genuinely wanted to replace her father, but people around him had seen something sinister in it. The relationship with his wife suffered the most. It was painful for Dave to realize that his partner had believed he was capable of harming her daughter. It was also offensive that Carrie had not even apologized. their life instantly took on a black and white tint on the day Amber disappeared. Surprisingly, despite all this, Dave and Carrie continued to communicate. The relationship was strained, but the man hoped to the last to prove his innocence to the woman he had once loved. And Carrie did not want to lose sight of the man who, in her opinion, knew a little more than everyone else. It was these facts that allowed the former lovers to reach the truth together and learn the truth. Since John Gardner had admitted his guilt, there was no trial under the deal. However, the judge still wanted to give the floor to those whom this tragedy had touched. John was called a monster, a sociopath, a serial maniac, and an animal, but he did not care. Once during the hearing, Gardner cried. However, all this was ordinary pretense. John simply wanted once again to avoid punishment for his crimes. When Candace reminded Gardner of the broken nose, he literally exploded. He did not like that a fragile girl had been able to defeat him in a fight, and now, in front of the public, she had humiliated him. John shouted and tried to prove to the lawyer that Candace had made everything up, that she had not managed to hit him, that he had simply let her go of his own free will. John was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of early release. The man remains behind bars to this day. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. Do you believe in curses? The Snowden family story began even with the slave trade. In 1865, the Snowden couple acquired a cotton plantation in Arkansas. This was land on which blood had previously been shed. It was here that powerless slaves experienced pain, torment, and unbearable suffering. It was here that the Snowden family decided to build a huge mansion and make it their family nest. This mansion was a symbol of family wealth and power, but later became famous for its grim history of a curse. The key figure in the family was Sally Snowden McKay, born in 1921. She grew up in an atmosphere of luxury and wealth. Sally studied at the best universities. As a teenager, she got married and moved to another state. But the first marriage did not work out, and at the age of 30, Sally married again to Mr. Harvey McKay, an actor living in New York. The woman gave birth to 3 daughters and was quite happy with her second husband. In the 1980s, Sally's father, the owner of the Snowden house, passed away. Sally's mother, despite her quite advanced age of 80, tried to keep the house and the business in proper condition, but it was not easy. In addition to the mansion, the Snowdens owned many real estate properties in this small town. Maintaining the huge mansion was not simple. Managing the Snowden house required full-time commitment. When Sally started having problems in her marriage, she decided that she needed a shakeup. The woman divorced Mr. McKay and returned to Arkansas to the house on the lake to take over the management of the family business and free her mother from extra responsibility and burden. Sally had not been to Snowden House for at least about 40 years. Now she herself was almost 70, and much had changed during that time. Her parents had built small cottages on the shore of the lake, which they rented out to vacationers. Upon returning to the family nest, Sally decided to settle in one of these mini cottages. In the 1990s, no one lived in the main building of the Snowden house anymore. It was rented out for holding celebratory events, and film studios began using the luxurious premises for filming. Sally managed all this process from her small, cozy cottage on the shore of the lake. However, she was the only resident there. Sally's nephew, Joseph Liebaker, was a successful musician. He played blues on the guitar. The man performed in local pubs. He was constantly invited by various groups to participate in city festivals. It was thanks to his musical career that Joseph was able to earn decent money and fully provide for his wife and children. One day, Joseph Liebaker came to visit in Arkansas, but later the man had to stay there forever. The thing is that the house where Joseph lived with his wife and children burned to the ground. During the investigation, it turned out that it was an intentional arson. While the man was away visiting the family estate with his family, burglars broke into the house. Among other things, they carried out several expensive musical instruments, as well as a huge amount of cash. After that, the criminals decided to destroy the evidence and set the entire house on fire. Everything that was dear to Joseph, Everything that the man had collected bit by bit over many years disappeared in an instant. From that moment, the life of the young and successful musician, as well as his family, was completely turned upside down. From a successful, well-off couple, they turned into homeless people. Now Joseph Lee Baker had to rebuild his life in Arkansas from scratch. The man got a job as a teacher at the local high school and helped his Aunt Sally manage the family business. Life in Snowden House was peaceful and calm until September 10th, 1996, when a tragedy occurred. On that day, neighbors noticed smoke rising from the territory of the majestic mansion. They immediately called emergency services at 911. The arriving firefighters discovered that one of the cottages on the shore of the lake was completely engulfed in flames. The fire was extinguished very quickly, so the flames did not have time to completely destroy the crime scene. As soon as the police arrived, it became clear that this was a burglary and a double murder. The aunt and nephew, Sally and Joseph, were in one of the cottages on the shore of the lake, where both were found dead. The cause of death was not the fire and not smoke inhalation. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The autopsy showed that 75-year-old Sally Snowden McKay and 52-year-old Joseph Lee Baker had been shot. The police immediately assumed that it was a botched robbery. Probably, the thief did not expect to run into the occupants of the cottage. Perhaps he was caught red-handed. The perpetrator got scared of responsibility and shot the only witnesses, and then panicked and set the house on fire to cover up the traces of the crime. The fate of the place where the young musician lived repeated itself. But this time, everything ended much more tragically for him. This time, Sally's nephew had no chance to start a new life. He died from a bullet from an unknown perpetrator. Soon, it turned out that the red Toyota Camry belonging to Sally had disappeared. Most likely, the criminal took the keys and fled the scene in the car. The police immediately sent out alerts, not suspecting that the car had already been found. Early in the morning, a local resident was driving along a winding road near the Snowden house and noticed an overturned red Toyota Camry in the ditch on the side of the road. He got out of the car to figure out the situation and saw a huge dent on the front of the vehicle. The resident thought that the driver had sustained serious injuries and hurried to the wrecked car to help, but there was no one inside. Probably, the injured person had gotten out on his own and gone for help. The person who found the Toyota ran to the nearest store and told them about the overturned car. The store owner immediately understood which car they were talking about. The man knew perfectly well that only one person in the area drove a car of this make, and it was Sally Snowden McKay. The store owner and the one who found the car went to the mansion and saw that it was already full of police. They told everything to the detectives investigating the case, and soon everything began to become clear. The perpetrator, who took the lives of Sally and her nephew, drove away in the owner's car and got into an accident. Now he was most likely injured and trying to escape on foot. Local residents were horrified at the thought that a dangerous criminal was roaming their quiet town, one who robbed and set houses on fire and then shot the owners. It was unknown what he would do next and who he would choose as his next victim. The police began to act quickly. Residents were advised to go to their homes and not go outside unless necessary. In search of evidence and the murder weapon, detectives searched the Snowden house. Divers were sent to Horseshoe Lake, but nothing was found in the house or at the bottom of the reservoir. However, a thorough inspection of the red Toyota Camry provided some small leads. On the passenger side door handle, criminologists discovered fingerprints that belonged to neither Sally nor Joseph. In addition, several dark hairs were found on the seat. The thing is that the criminal database appeared in the United States only in 1997. It was initially impossible to check the found fingerprints and hairs. The detectives were sure that this was not the first attack on the perpetrator's record, and that not every burglar carried a pistol with him and was ready to use it. The investigation moved very slowly. In the small town, there were not enough police officers, not enough resources, and not enough funding. Nevertheless, the authorities did what they could. They interviewed witnesses and talked to neighbors. From morning until evening, they combed the area in search of any leads, and this bore fruit. One local resident noticed the red Toyota Camry racing down the road at high speed on the day of the incident, even before it overturned. According to the eyewitness, two young black men were sitting behind the wheel and in the passenger seat. Unfortunately, he did not have time to see their faces. Although this was only a small piece of information, it allowed the detectives to narrow the circle of suspects a little. The area where Sally's mansion was located was populated predominantly by white residents, and people of a different skin color immediately came under attention. Meanwhile, the interviews continued. The police were looking for a person who could have had access to the Snowden house. One of the young sons of the deceased Joseph Liebecker told them about a black boy whose mother worked as a cleaner for Sally. The teenager lived on the grounds of the mansion in one of the cottages on the shore of the lake. He was raised by his mother and grandmother, and this teenager turned out to be 15-year-old Travis Lewis. It turned out that Travis had already committed minor crimes. A year before Sally's death, the young man had stolen several checks from her. The naive youth believed that he could easily cash them at the bank. However, when Travis tried to do so, he was refused. The institution immediately suspected fraud and contacted the account owner, Sally. Later, Travis managed to steal several video games from Joseph Liebecker's children. The thing is that the latter often invited the cleaner's son out of pity to play video games with them, and Travis decided not to miss the opportunity to profit. There were other minor pranks by the teenager, but each time Sally McKay forgave the cleaner's son. She was a very understanding woman. Because of poverty, Travis was deprived of many things. The mansion owner believed that in this way, he was trying to compensate for a happy childhood. Now the question arose whether Sally's excessive kindness had become her curse. Could it be that Travis, having avoided consequences for his minor thefts, became more confident in himself and decided to commit something serious? For example, robbing the cottage. This was a terrible version. The number one suspect in the double murder case was a teenage boy from the family that worked at the mansion. And Joseph Liebecker taught Travis English at the local high school. Liebecker's children were friends with Lewis. This kid was very closely connected to the lives of the deceased. Travis's whereabouts on the day of the crime could not be established, as he had been suspended from school. The teenager denied involvement in the burglary and shooting and provided the police with an alibi. But his alibi was unconvincing. He insisted that he had spent the entire day at home with his mother. And although his mother confirmed his words, she could have lied just to protect her son from prison. To make sure Travis's words were truthful, the authorities decided to test him on a lie detector. A polygraph is a device that records a person's physiological reactions during questioning. It does not detect lies at all. It measures pulse, breathing, blood pressure, and other factors. The polygraph does not recognize lies. It only analyzes changes in the body. The problem with lie detector tests is that a person may simply be experiencing stress and nervousness, but the device will interpret these signals as anxiety about telling a falsehood. Polygraph tests are no longer used in criminal cases because they are unreliable, but earlier the polygraph was considered serious evidence of guilt. Travis Lewis was forced to undergo a polygraph test, and it showed that the guy was not lying. They believed the polygraph and immediately released him. The investigation continued. However, all roads still led to this guy. There simply were no other suspects. Not finding other criminals, the police made Travis take another polygraph test. The second time, the teenager failed the test, and they believed the polygraph again. As a result, the guy was arrested for breaking and entering, robbery, and double murder, relying only on the results of the lie detector. After the arrest, Lewis's story changed dramatically. Now he insisted that he did not participate in the murder, but no longer denied the break-in and theft. He told the police that he had not acted alone and tried to shift all the blame onto his friend Andre. According to Travis, they had developed a plan. He was supposed to rob Joseph Liebecker's house, and Andre was supposed to rob Sally McKay's cottage. The guys split up, and each went to carry out his part of the agreement. Sometime later, Andre came for him in the red Toyota Camry. His friend admitted that the robbery had not gone according to plan. He had to take the lives of two people. Andre begged Travis to get in the car and escape as quickly as possible before they were discovered. The story matched what the local resident had seen. Two young black guys in a red car were speeding at high speed. The police arrested Andre, but the guy denied everything. There was no evidence against him except circumstantial. The detectives decided not to bother and released the teenager. They decided not to use the polygraph this time. What if it showed the wrong thing, since they already had one underage criminal in custody? Travis's situation was bad. His fingerprints matched the fingerprints found in the stolen car. The 16-year-old was charged with burglary and double murder. In addition, his DNA matched the DNA of the hairs found in the Toyota. Many people believed that Andre had gotten away with a serious crime, and now his friend had to take the fall alone. The authorities decided that the now 16-year-old Travis Lewis would be tried as an adult. In the state of Arkansas, this meant that for 2 stolen lives, he could face the death penalty. Martha McKay, one of Sally's 3 daughters, was devastated by the loss of her mother and cousin and was incredibly angry at Travis. But even she considered the execution of a minor youth too harsh a punishment. This contradicted her beliefs and values. Martha spoke out against the death sentence and ultimately got her way. At the trial, Travis, on the advice of his lawyers, pleaded guilty to a first-degree felony. He was sentenced to 28.5 years in prison. However, in prison, he recanted his confession, again shifting all the blame onto his friend Andre. Only now Travis could no longer change the testimony he had given under oath. Sally Snowden McKay and Joseph Lee Baker were dead. The criminal who had taken the lives of 2 people was serving his sentence behind bars. But the horrific story did not end there. After the tragedy, the Snowden house passed into the ownership of one of Sally's sisters. About 10 years later, management of the family business fell on the shoulders of the children of the deceased. Sally's daughter, who had once spoken out against the death penalty for a minor criminal, now moved into one of the cottages on the shore of the lake. Martha McKay grew up in San Francisco, California. She graduated from the University of Washington in Seattle, and several years after her mother's death, returned to Horseshoe Lake, Arkansas, to take care of the Snowden house. At that time, repairs had begun in the mansion. The new owner wanted to completely update the interior so that it would match the spirit of the 21st century. Martha replaced the plumbing and interior finishing, updated the outdated lighting fixtures and hardware, and added modern elements to the outdated design. As a result, the legendary Snowden house, built in colonial style, began to look completely different, more modern. Martha McKay was a successful businesswoman who was written about in local magazines. The woman quickly gained popularity in the area. Everyone simply adored her. She had a certain gift for charming people. Martha was sociable, cheerful, and enterprising. Every day she walked her dog around the reservoir, sometimes several times. Local residents affectionately nicknamed her the Lady of the Lake. Martha enjoyed life. She loved her house so much that she created a special page on social media. There, the woman posted updates showing everything that was happening behind the walls of the renovated mansion: dinner parties, social dinners, relaxing in hammocks on the shore of the lake, and much more. Now it was not just a family mansion, it was the woman's pride. She literally breathed new life into the place where a bloody family tragedy had occurred several years earlier. In reality, Martha had grieved for a long time after her mother's death, and to somehow come to terms with it, she chose an unusual way. The woman began to practice Buddhism, whose main goal was to learn to love everyone, be kind to everyone, and most importantly, to forgive the one who caused you pain. In the end, Martha did something incredible. She forgave the man who had been convicted of murdering her mother. The woman felt that he had repented of what he had done. Wanting to demonstrate the decision she had made, she wrote to Travis Lewis in prison. He replied, thanking her for the forgiveness. This is how their correspondence began, and a more than strange friendship started. Upon learning about this, the family was shocked, and Martha moved from letters to actions. She asked for the opportunity to visit Travis in prison. Relatives tried to convince her not to do it, but Martha was adamant. She believed that by sincerely forgiving the murderer's soul, she would be able to cope with the grief and come to terms with the loss of a loved one. In addition, Martha was not completely sure of his guilt. After all, according to Travis, it was his friend Andre who had pulled the trigger. It was Lewis who had to take the fall for the crime, And this apparent injustice only strengthened Martha's feelings. Now the woman regularly visited the convicted criminal in prison, and in between visits she wrote letters to him. Despite the 24-year age difference, their friendship grew stronger. The family did not understand how Martha could communicate with the man who had taken the lives of two people close to them. They did not believe that Travis had reformed and worried that now Martha, by meeting with him, was putting herself in danger. In 2018, Lewis filed for parole. Martha also took part in the hearing and very loudly expressed her position. She believed that Travis deserved a second chance and should be released as soon as possible. Martha McKay's testimony was very convincing. No parole board had ever heard a victim's daughter fight for the release of the criminal who had taken her mother's life, and it worked. In 2018, Travis Lewis was released after 2 decades in prison. At that time, he was 37 years old. He had gone to prison as a teenager. For the first time in his adult life, he found himself in a world where there was no familiar circle of acquaintances. Martha McKay understood that without support, Travis's rehabilitation could drag on. The woman decided to take him under her wing and help the man adapt to his new life. She offered him a job as a gardener at the Snowden house, where he had once taken the lives of her mother and cousin. And what was even worse, she invited Lewis to settle in one of the cottages on the shore of the lake. Travis's mother, Gladys, all the time while her son was in prison, continued to work as a cleaner in the mansion, and now mother and son were reunited. During the first year, everything went perfectly. Martha's plan worked. Travis seemed like a changed man. However, soon his enthusiasm for freedom faded, and the man returned to his old habits. Regular use of illegal drugs and skipping work became the norm. This caused dissatisfaction and disappointment on Martha's part. After everything she had done for him, Travis openly ignored her comments and requests. Over time, Lewis began to steal. Minor crimes began to multiply. History was repeating itself. When Travis was 15 years old, he also stole. His own mother, Gladys, was the most worried about this. One day, Gladys took Martha McKay aside and warned her to stay away from her son because he had gone back to his old ways. In early 2020, Martha sold one of the most magnificent chandeliers from the mansion for $10,000. She was paid in cash. The money lay in the Snowden house for several days, but then it suddenly disappeared. Suspicion immediately fell on Travis, who was one of the few who knew about the presence of money in the house. In addition, he had a habit of taking whatever was lying around. The naive Martha was shocked and disappointed. The man she had sincerely tried to help had betrayed her in the worst possible way. This finally convinced her that Travis had not changed and could not be trusted. Martha made the difficult decision to fire Lewis from his position as gardener and ask him to move out of the cottage on the shore of the lake that she had kindly provided to him. But the man reacted extremely negatively. A terrible quarrel broke out between them. Travis got angry. The former convict refused to admit that he was doing anything wrong. The man was used to being forgiven for everything, so why was he being punished this time? However, the owner of the house desperately insisted that Travis leave her property, and the man had to do so. Enraged by what he saw as injustice, Travis slammed the door loudly and left. Martha hoped that this would be the end of it, but she was wrong. Lewis returned this time with even more sinister thoughts. On the morning of March 25th, 2020, the police received a signal about the alarm going off at the Snowden house on Horseshoe Lake. They hurried to the scene and discovered that the back door of the house was wide open. The officers went inside and called for the owner. There was silence in the house. No one responded to the police officers' calls, but the employees clearly heard footsteps. Someone was walking upstairs. There were definitely people in the mansion, but they did not want to be discovered, so they did not respond. The officers began to slowly climb the stairs when a black man jumped out of a second-floor window. In an attempt to escape, he rushed to a car parked nearby, but the car would not start. The fugitive jumped out, looked around, and realized that he could not escape. There were police officers everywhere. Swimming across the lake was the only chance of salvation. The man rushed to the reservoir at full speed and dived in. The police stopped on the shore to see in which direction he would swim. No one appeared on the surface of the water. The officers rushed into the lake to the place where the criminal had dived, but they could not find anyone. The man simply disappeared. At that moment, it was unclear whether he had drowned immediately or whether he had managed to hold his breath and somehow miraculously escape from the law enforcement officers. In any case, it looked like some kind of trick. The suspect literally dissolved in the water. The police had to warn the residents of the area about the incident. While some officers went from house to house, others went to Martha McKay's mansion. Rushing in pursuit of the fugitive, they did not have time to properly examine the rooms. Soon, it became clear that the man had tried to escape from the crime scene. On the upper landing of the stairs lay a pile of bedding soaked in some flammable substance. A strong smell of fuel hit the nostrils. Inside the bundle lay the dead body of 63-year-old Martha McKay. Because of the numerous wounds on the owner's body, the bedding was soaked in red. She had been brutally killed. Martha became the third member of the family to die in the family estate, and the perpetrator was the same person who several decades earlier had taken the lives of her mother and cousin. Travis Lewis had returned to rob and finish off the family that had shown him compassion all his life and had forgiven even the most cruel offenses. The bottom of the reservoir had to be scanned with a special device, which found something. Several hours after Martha McKay's death, the dead body of her murderer, Travis Lewis, was raised from the depths of the lake. It turned out that he had drowned almost instantly after jumping into the water. The man was under the influence of a whole cocktail of illegal drugs. Perhaps he lost consciousness, hit his head on something, or simply could not rise to the surface to take a breath of air. Travis Lewis died at the age of 39. The man who had terrorized the McKay family for decades disappeared in an instant. Not understanding what he was doing, Lewis had sentenced himself to death and had even carried out the sentence himself. The motive for the crime was again a failed robbery. By a cruel irony of fate, mother and daughter had prematurely left this world because of the same person, with a difference of 23 years. The McKay family was in complete despair. They simply could not believe that something like this could happen again. Although other relatives had never approved of Martha's friendship with Travis, they had not even allowed the thought that a good attitude toward the criminal would backfire on her and that her life would end in such a terrible way. As for the Snowden house, since 2024, it has been owned by a new family. Currently, the building is planned to be demolished in order to build a completely new mansion in its place, hoping that this will protect the place from the curse. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. The heroine of today's story is 23-year-old Rachel Jane Nichol. She was born on November 23, 1968, in the family of Andrew and Monica in Essex County, England. From childhood, the kind and generous Rachel loved taking care of babies living nearby or helping elderly people. Nature had endowed the girl with talent. She sang beautifully, studied acting, and danced in a ballet studio. Teachers predicted a future on stage for her, believing that Nichol could make a successful career in the arts. However, Rachel chose a different path. She was earning a degree in English literature while working part-time as a model and as a lifeguard at a swimming pool in Richmond. At the age of 19, Nichol met 25-year-old Andre Hanscom. Their communication quickly turned into a romantic relationship. Already after the first date, the girl called her mother Monica and said that she had met the man of her dreams. Soon after the start of the relationship, Rachel found out she was pregnant. The pregnancy was a shock for them because the young people had not yet planned to have children. But in the end, after weighing all the pros and cons, they decided in favor of the baby. Rachel moved into Andre's apartment in Battersea in South London, and on August 11th, 1989, their son Alex was born, full name Alexander Lewis Hanscom. The young parents were over the moon with happiness. Rachel completely devoted herself to caring for her son, putting her education on the back burner. Although in her heart she had always dreamed of a career on television, the role of a mother also really suited her. Rachel's family consisted of her partner Andre, son Alex, and their dog named Molly. a cross between a Labrador and a Greyhound. They called themselves a little pack and lived in perfect harmony. The young woman was making big plans for life, but everything changed on July 15th, 1992. This day began like any other, but ended in tragedy. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. That day, Andre went to work, while Rachel and 2-year-old Alex started their day with a morning walk with the dog Molly. Usually, they walk different routes, and this time they chose Wimbledon Common, a huge open space in southwest London. Wimbledon Common, with a total area of 460 hectares, was a vast area with forest tracks, various bodies of water, and zones for informal recreation. It was a specially protected natural territory where natural flora and fauna predominated. On hot summer weekends, this unique place attracted thousands of visitors. However, on the morning of Wednesday, July 15th, 1992, it was quite quiet and not crowded there. Although most of the territory of Wimbledon Common was an open plain, there were several wooded areas. Rachel and Alex walked cheerfully along a wide path, with Molly running ahead. Everything was calm until suddenly there was a feeling that someone was watching them. Mother and son simultaneously looked back and saw a man with a black bag over his shoulder heading toward them. The stranger, approaching, grabbed Alex and pushed him face down into the dirt. Then he pulled out a knife and stabbed Rachel several times with it. And Alex, who had only a couple of weeks left until his 3rd birthday, still remembers this attack to this day. When he got up, his mom was lying motionless nearby. The boy saw the attacker walk up to the stream and wash the blood off his face. Rachel, who had fallen silent on the ground, looked peaceful, as if she were sleeping. The baby tugged at his mother's clothes, cried, and called out, "Wake up, Mommy, wake up!" But despite his young age, he soon realized that Mommy had fallen asleep forever and would never wake up again. Alex ran back along the path they had walked with Rachel just a few minutes earlier. Bursting out of the wooded area into the open space, he saw passers-by who immediately understood that the boy needed help. His dirt-covered face had tear tracks, and his hands, with which he had hugged his mom, were red. The police were called to the scene immediately. Alex was given a sedative and taken to the hospital. News of the attack spread like wildfire and instantly became nationwide. The mass media reported non-stop about the incident. Reporters gathered around Wimbledon Common and kept watch outside the hospital where little Alex was. It soon became clear that although other visitors were in Wimbledon Common that morning, the only witness to the attack was one person, Rachel's 2-year-old son. Andre was at work when he was informed of the tragedy. The police contacted the man and told him that his 2-year-old son was in the hospital. A frightened Andre immediately headed there. He was so attached to Rachel that he could not imagine life without her. On the way to the hospital, the man went over in his head various ways to painlessly leave this world together with Alex to follow Rachel. He did not want to live without her and did not understand how the child would cope with the loss of the closest person. At the hospital, a child psychologist prepared Andre for the meeting with his son and explained how to properly tell the boy that his mother had died. But little Alex already understood without this that he would never see his mother again, would never go for a walk with her, and would never fall asleep on her lap again. He had seen his mom lying on the ground and not moving. She had died and was now watching over him from heaven. Meanwhile, the police at Wimbledon Common were questioning people who had been in the park that morning. It soon turned out that no one had seen the attacker, covered in the victim's blood, leaving the crime scene. And this was surprising, considering that there were about 500 people in the park. When detectives first examined the crime scene, they noticed a scrap of paper on Rachel's forehead, an old receipt from a store. At first, they were puzzled by this fact, but later found out that the receipt had fallen out of Rachel's pocket during the attack. Little Alex had picked it up from the ground and placed it on his mother's head, thinking it was a band-aid or bandage that could heal the wounds and make his mom wake up. The victim's body was sent for autopsy, which showed that she had been subjected to sexual assault and had received about 49 stab wounds. One of them had been inflicted across the neck and had almost decapitated the woman. There were practically no clues at the crime scene. the investigators could not find any DNA traces, as at that time in the early 90s, the technology was very limited. Forensic experts collected samples from Rachel's body, assuming it could be DNA, but due to the limitations of forensic examination at the time, they could not accurately determine the nature of the samples, so this data turned out to be useless. Identifying criminals by DNA was not yet possible then. There were no witnesses other than 2-year-old Alex. Apart from a shoe print found at the scene and traces of red paint on the boy's hair of unknown origin, the detectives found nothing. All this indicated that the investigation would be difficult. One thing was clear: the criminal needed to be found as soon as possible, since he was very dangerous. Apparently, the attacker was not acquainted with Rachel and seemed to have chosen the victim at random. There was a high probability that sooner or later he would strike again and take someone else's life. The day after the tragedy, Rachel's partner Andre appeared on television with an appeal to the public to report any information about the suspected rapist. And this step yielded results. The police received hundreds of phone calls, but none of them led to significant leads. The only person who had really seen the criminal's face and could help identify him was little Alex, but he was only 2 years old. Due to his age, he could not describe the stranger who had attacked his mom. To obtain at least some information about the crime, the police installed recording devices and cameras in the house of Alex's grandparents, where he had to live after Rachel's death. This was done in case the child accidentally remembered something and talked about the sad events of that day. Detectives visited Alex and his father Andre very often to try to extract the necessary information from the child. During these visits, they used various dolls to help Alex find words to describe the attacker's appearance. For example, one doll had white skin, another had black skin, a third had gray hair, a fourth had brown hair, and so on. The officers showed the boy the dolls and asked if any of them looked like the man who had hurt his mom. Together with his father and 2 detectives, Alex also visited a psychologist, where he played with toys and colored pictures. The specialist tried to talk to the child so that he would remember the details of the attack. But the little boy did not want to talk about this topic. He wanted to play and stubbornly tried to drown out the psychologist's voice by banging toys on the table. Experiencing what he had seen and then discussing it again and again with detectives and psychologists was agonizing for him. It was obvious that all this was done with good intentions. The police were trying to catch the criminal, but the child simply did not want to hear anything and did not want to remember the day when his mom left him forever. In the end, the detectives still managed to get a fairly detailed description of the attacker from Alex. He said it was a white man with a short haircut, dressed in a white button-up shirt with a collar. For some reason, according to the child, the belt was worn over the shirt rather than threaded through the loops. The man was wearing blue trousers and brown boots. He was carrying a black bag. Alex described the stranger as he remembered him. Unfortunately, given the child's age, the detectives could not fully rely on the description he gave. Due to the stress he had experienced, the boy's memories could have been significantly distorted. Nevertheless, this description gave at least some idea of what the attacker looked like. The press actively covered this case, thereby adding stress to Alex's family. He became known as the boy who saw his mother being stabbed to death. Journalists desperately tried to talk to Andre and Alex to photograph them, so they constantly kept watch near the house. At Rachel's funeral, Alex had to cover his face with a baseball cap so that the intrusive reporters would not bother the boy. At this time, detectives were questioning eyewitnesses, taking hundreds of statements, and trying to narrow down the circle of suspects, but there was a catastrophic lack of evidence. It was then that they turned to criminal profiling specialist Paul Britton with a request to create a psychological portrait of the criminal based on his behavior and the details of the attack, so that potential suspects could later be identified using this profile. Paul Britton suggested that the person who had taken Rachel Nichols' life was a man aged about 20 to 30, a local resident of the Wimbledon Common area, as he most likely knew the area well, possibly single or living with his parents. This person watched a lot of adult films, was dominant in intimate relationships, and dreamed of realizing his cruel fantasies. He most likely did not have a girlfriend, but in the past, he had minor offenses related to violence. The detectives used Paul's profile, Alex's description, and eyewitness statements to create a composite sketch of the main suspect. Out of the many tips received from the public, only one was confirmed as more or less reliable. This testimony was provided by a woman named Jamie. She reported that on the morning of Rachel Nichols' death, she had seen a man with a dog on Wimbledon Common who was behaving suspiciously. Jamie noticed that the stranger looked confused, did not know where he was going, and avoided her gaze. Every time she tried to look him in the eyes, he turned away. A few minutes later, Jamie saw the man again. This time, he was following some woman across the heath. This seemed strange and suspicious to Jamie, especially after it became known about the attack on Rachel. As a result, Jamie helped create a composite sketch, and her testimony made this man the main suspect in the Nichol case. After the resulting image of the alleged criminal was shown to the general public, calls began to come into the police from people who recognized neighbors, friends, or former classmates in the photo. At the same time, everyone named different names, but the name Colin was mentioned most often. In 1992, Colin Stagg was 29 years old. He lived with his dog in an apartment in Wimbledon, less than 1.5 kilometers from the place where 23-year-old Rachel Nichol was killed. At that time, he was unemployed and avoided contact with neighbors. The police quickly established that Colin Stagg had indeed been on Wimbledon Common on the day the mother and son were attacked. Many people thought that Colin looked similar to the composite sketch. As a result, he became the main suspect in the case of the murder of Rachel Nichol. When the police turned their attention to Colin, about 2 months had passed since the attack. By that time, the case had received wide publicity. All this time, the detectives investigating the crime were under strong pressure from the public, frightened that the maniac was still at large, and under the close attention of the press, which demanded that the criminal be found. The authorities wanted to solve this case as soon as possible, and even though they had no evidence against Colin Stagg, they decided that he fit the description drawn up by Paul Britton, and therefore could well be responsible for the attack. To gather evidence, the police organized an operation codenamed Edsel. What had Colin Stagg been doing on July 15, 1992, when Rachel died? Early in the morning, the man had been walking his dog on the heath near Wimbledon Common. Usually they wandered around the area for a long time, but that day he had a severe headache, so Colin decided to shorten the route. At home, the man took a painkiller and lay down for a while. While he was in his apartment, Rachel Nichol and her son Alex took the dog Molly and went to Wimbledon Common, where they were soon attacked by an unknown man. When the medicine took effect and the headache subsided, Colin decided to take the dog out again, as she was desperately asking to go outside. By the time he reached Wimbledon Common, Rachel's body had already been found. Police were swarming everywhere. Officers were guarding the crime scene and not allowing anyone to approach. One of the detectives stopped Colin and asked him to give his name and address. Stagg provided the information without any problem and said that he had been on the heath that morning, but had not seen anyone or noticed anything suspicious. About 2 months passed before, in September 1992, the police raided Colin's apartment in Wimbledon and informed him that he was a suspect in the attack on Rachel Nichol. During the search of the apartment, several items were found that seemed inappropriate to the detectives. Drawings resembling satanic symbols hung on the walls. Colin explained that the drawings belonged to his brother, who had lived in the apartment before him. His brother was into heavy rock and depicted his emotions in the form of strange symbols, and Colin simply had not bothered to remove them after moving in. According to some sources, books on the occult, gloves, and a knife in a sheath were also found in the apartment. One way or another, Colin was arrested and taken to the police station for questioning. He was in shock, as he had never had problems with the law before. The police questioned the man for 3 days, and Stagg told them everything he could. He claimed that he was not involved in the attack. The detectives also looked into previous incidents. In the summer before Rachel's death, one woman had reported to the police that she had seen a man resembling Colin Stagg on the heath. He was naked. When questioned by investigators, Colin admitted that he did indeed sunbathe naked on the heath every summer, because the place was often used by other nudists. With no other evidence, the authorities decided to charge Colin with indecent behavior. He was fined £200 and released. It seemed he had gotten away with it, but things were not so simple. Now the police, the mass media, and the public viewed this man as a sex offender. They considered him a pervert who exposed himself to the public. The press followed Colin almost everywhere. He was filmed and photographed, and these pictures were sold to newspapers. The public was indignant that the criminal who had taken Rachel Nichols' life had been released. At the same time, the authorities were determined to prove Colin Stagg's guilt and focused all their efforts on this. They no longer considered other suspects. At this time, a woman named Julie Pines contacted the police. She said she had some information about Colin. Julie had seen his photographs in the newspapers and decided to tell about an incident that had occurred between them about 2 years earlier. Julie had placed an ad in the newspaper in the Lonely Hearts column. It was the printed version of modern dating sites. The ad included her name, age, interests, and phone number. Colin Stagg saw Julie's ad and responded to it. He was also single, so he decided to try to find a girlfriend through the newspaper. The young people talked on the phone several times, and Colin thought everything was going well. He even began to think that their friendly relationship might at some point move to a new level. Stagg even wrote a letter to Julie in which he shared his intimate fantasies about contact in nature. The woman did not like the letter and stopped communicating with Colin. However, she kept the message and, 2 years later, when Stagg became the main suspect in the attack on Rachel, decided to hand it over to the police. However, the letter was not direct evidence of the author's guilt, as it had been written 2 years before the crime. Nevertheless, it gave the detectives additional grounds to believe that Colin might be involved in the murder. So, all the evidence against Stagg at that time was circumstantial. To charge him, the police needed solid evidence, and the detective team, including criminal profiling specialist Paul Britton, developed Operation Edzell. An attractive blonde with the fictional name Lizzie James, in reality an undercover policewoman, was supposed to get close to Colin, seduce him, and try to make him confess to the crime. Lizzie James, introducing herself as a friend of Julie Pines from the Lonely Hearts column, wrote a letter to Stagg. In it, she expressed a desire to get to know the man better. Lizzie admitted that she had read his letter in which he had shared his intimate fantasies with Julie and that she had liked it. Suspecting nothing, Colin was very flattered, as he had never had much success with the opposite sex. In his messages, he tried to be romantic and expressed a desire to invite Lizzie on a date, for a walk where they could have a glass of wine, and maybe afterward he would kiss her. Stagg admitted that he had never had intimate relations with anyone before. All this sounded very modest and innocent, while Lizzie's letters were the complete opposite. The woman described her dark, intimate desires in minute detail. She wrote that she wanted a man to make her feel defenseless and humiliated. As Lizzie became more and more explicit in her messages, Colin did the same in response. Eventually, he wrote that he would like to spend the night with her, but immediately apologized for his words. Despite Lizzie encouraging him to be more harsh and uninhibited, Stagg apologized at the end of every letter and said, "I'm very sorry if I crossed the line. I'm sorry if I went too far." Colin and Lizzie exchanged more than 40 letters, but the police still did not have the evidence needed to charge Stagg with the murder, so they decided to intensify the operation. Lizzie called her chosen one, but could not extract any incriminating evidence from him. All conversations were recorded, but Colin never mentioned Rachel Nichols, and then the detectives decided to organize a meeting. It was risky because, in essence, they were sending an undercover policewoman to meet a very dangerous man. The investigators believed that Colin was the criminal who had attacked the mother and child. They needed to make sure Lizzie would be safe, so all meetings took place in public places. Colin and Lizzie first met in Hyde Park in London. The woman was wearing a recording device so that the detectives could listen to their conversations. And nearby, there were always other plainclothes officers in case of an emergency. Over the next few months, Colin and Lizzie met several times. During one of these meetings, Lizzie told a story about how she had had a boyfriend who was into black magic and that she had participated in the human sacrifice of a pregnant woman. Deep down, Colin thought Lizzie was crazy, but since he really liked her, he wanted to get her into bed. He simply ignored this creepy story. But the police saw alarming signals in Stagg's behavior, because any normal person hearing something like that would have been shocked. And Colin, in their opinion, showed no reaction. Then, Lizzie started a conversation with Colin about the attack on Rachel Nichol, and confessed that she had always dreamed of being in the victim's place. She assured him that she would actually like it if Colin turned out to be the criminal, and even promised to arrange a night of love on the condition that he confessed to attacking the mother and son. The fact was that the detectives were desperately trying to force a confession out of the man. But Stagg claimed that he was innocent and had nothing to do with it. He honestly told Lizzie, "Sorry, but I didn't do it. I didn't take Rachel's life." Colin, in order to win Lizzie's favor, did indeed come up with a couple of terrible stories about supposedly attacking a woman with a knife in the park. But he continued to claim that he had nothing to do with Nichol's death and had simply made up those stories. Soon, Colin completely lost interest in Lizzie. He wanted to spend the night with her, but it became clear to him that this would not happen until he confessed to a crime he had not committed. One day, the man simply stopped responding. In total, they communicated for about 7 months, and Stagg never once admitted that he had been involved in Rachel's death. Nevertheless, on August 17th, 1993, a year after the crime, 30-year-old Colin was arrested on suspicion of attacking Rachel Nichol. He was taken to the police station and questioning began. The detectives told him about Operation Edsel, which had been conducted for 7 months with the aim of catching him. The undercover policewoman, Lizzie James, was brought into the room, and the letters Colin had written to her were read out. Realizing that he had fallen into a trap, the man refused to give any comments. Colin's case was sent to court, and he himself was sent to prison. Stagg remained in custody for more than a year before the trial began. The evidence of his guilt consisted of the materials collected during Operation Edsel and the profile of the criminal drawn up by Paul Britton. However, the prosecution had neither direct evidence, nor forensic examination, nor the murder weapon. Soon after the start of the trial, the judge ruled that the evidence collected during Operation Edsel, including the letters and recordings of conversations, was inadmissible because the way it had been obtained was unfair to Colin. During the covert operation, the defendant had simply been forced to talk about his cruel, intimate fantasies. The judge said that the police had shown excessive zeal and had tried to accuse Stagg using the crudest methods of deception. As a result, the case was closed, and Colin was officially acquitted and released. Although Operation Edsel was later criticized by the media, many publications continued to consider Stagg the criminal despite the acquittal. In 1994, Andre Hanscom, the common-law husband of the deceased Rachel, and his son Alex moved to France. They were forced to hide from the intrusive pursuit of the press. Once, a photographer managed to take a picture of little Alex, which was published in a newspaper. This created a serious danger to the boy's life, since Alex was the only witness to the attack on his mother, and the criminal, who was still at large, could come after him. Andre understood that Alex needed a normal life and did not want his childhood to be overshadowed by constant media attention. To ensure his son's safety, he took the child and secretly moved to France. Although Stagg was acquitted, the police did not look for new suspects, still considering Colin guilty. Moreover, a huge amount of time and £3 million sterling had been spent on Operation Edsel. It turned out that all this money had been wasted. For many years, the case remained unsolved. In 2002, on the 10th anniversary of Rachel Nichol's death, Scotland Yard created a new team of detectives for a reinvestigation. They reviewed all the evidence and witness statements, and also took DNA samples from Andre and Alex, who by that time was 13 years old. A tiny particle, presumably DNA, had been found on Rachel's body, but due to the limited technology of the time, the results had been inconclusive. Now, with the development of forensics, it became possible to re-examine the samples taken from the victim's body and conduct a more accurate analysis. To identify the criminal, the DNA sample was compared with Colin Stagg's DNA. The results showed similarity, but in 2002, the technology still did not allow precise identification of the person. Only 2 years later, repeated tests confirmed that Colin Stagg's DNA did not match the unknown sample, and this became important evidence of his innocence. The test results were entered into the database, and in 2004, 12 years after Rachel Nichols' death, a match was established with the DNA of a man named Robert Napper. This was a 38-year-old convicted criminal who was being held in a psychiatric hospital in Berkshire, England. Robert Clive Napper was born on February 25, 1966. He was the eldest of 4 children and grew up in a violent environment. His father often attacked his mother, and little Robert witnessed constant conflicts and fights. When the boy was 9 years old, his parents divorced. The children were placed in temporary foster care. A visit to a child psychiatrist ended with a diagnosis. It turned out that Robert suffered from Asperger's syndrome. Later, in his teenage years, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, a mental illness that affects thinking and behavior, as such people's perception of reality is disrupted. Because of this, Robert made strange statements. He claimed that he had met the Queen of England, was a Nobel Prize laureate, and even that soldiers of the Irish Republican Army had captured him, tortured him, and wanted to cut off his fingers. From childhood, it was difficult for Robert to study at school. He did not get along with other children. He had almost no friends, which is why he kept to himself and often became the object of ridicule and bullying from his peers. When Robert was 12 years old, a terrible event occurred in his life. During a hiking trip, he was sexually abused by an adult family friend of the Nappers. The man was arrested and sent to prison, but after the assault, Robert's already difficult character became even worse. The teenager completely withdrew into himself, became obsessed with cleanliness and order, which could indicate the presence of obsessive-compulsive disorder. His behavior became aggressive, especially toward his younger brothers and sisters. He often got into fights, bullied them, and even spied on them. Once Robert was caught peeping at his sister while she was getting dressed. At the age of 16, Napper dropped out of school and enrolled in catering courses. He often changed jobs and did not stay anywhere for long. At the age of 18, his mother kicked him out of the house. The reasons for this action are not entirely clear, but they were probably somehow connected with his aggressive behavior. After that, Robert got a job at a plastics factory and lived in a hostel in Plumstead. In 1986, he was arrested for carrying a loaded air pistol. This was his first criminal offense, and the police limited themselves to a warning. A couple of years later, when Robert turned 20, he began peeping at local women and exposing himself in public. In 1989, Robert Napper carried out a series of attacks on girls in London, for which he received the nickname the Green Chain Rapist. The Green Chain was a series of green paths connecting much of southeast London. The first serious attack occurred in August of that year in Plumstead. The homeowner had accidentally left the back door unlocked. Robert took advantage of the opportunity and broke in while the woman was drying her hair in the bathroom on the second floor, and her children were playing downstairs. The attacker went up the stairs and, threatening her with a knife, forced the housewife to have sexual intercourse with him. If she refused, the man threatened to harm her children. After the rapist fled, the woman immediately contacted the police, and experts managed to extract a DNA sample of the attacker from the semen. Soon after this, Robert Napper confessed to his biological mother about the crime he had committed. Without hesitation, she called the police and told them everything. However, for some reason, the detectives did not show proper interest in her statement, and Robert remained free. The negligence of the authorities allowed him to continue his crimes, and his mother forever cut her son out of her life, stopping all contact with him. In the following years, Robert sexually assaulted several more women. Most of the attacks occurred on the Green Chain, in the system of open spaces and paths in southeast London. Napper wandered around parks, watching women and looking for victims. Over time, the attacks became increasingly brutal, and many victims mentioned the presence of a cold weapon. In one case, Robert stabbed a woman in the chest with a knife, but she survived. The exact number of Robert Napper's victims is unknown. Different sources give different figures, from several dozen to 100. When he was finally caught, He was convicted of only 2 acts of violence and 2 attempts. However, it is believed that he committed many more crimes. Many women reported the attacks to the police, but their complaints were not properly investigated. After several statements from victims, forensic experts were able to identify the attacker's DNA from his semen. A composite sketch of the criminal was also created and published in the hope that someone would recognize the green chain rapist and contact the police. And that is what happened. After the publication of the composite sketch, Napper's neighbors contacted the authorities. Robert was asked to come to the police station and provide a DNA sample, but he did not show up. Then, the detectives asked him to come in for an interview again, but he did not appear a second time. It was incredible, but the police refused to take further action. Robert's behavior was simply left without attention. If the detectives had shown vigilance, other crimes might not have happened. Instead, having calmly avoided police pursuit, Napper continued his attacks and eventually moved on to murder. His first victim was 23-year-old young mother Rachel Nichol, whom he stabbed 49 times in front of her 2-year-old son, Alex. The police failed to establish a connection between the attacks on women on the Green Chain and the murder on Wimbledon Common. Despite several similarities, the women were mainly attacked in public places and the criminal threatened them with a knife. The Green Chain Crimes Investigation Team contacted the team of detectives working on Rachel's case. They suggested that the attacks might be connected. However, the Edsel task force was so confident in Colin Stagg's guilt that they saw no connection between the cases and almost refused to investigate. The detectives once again missed the opportunity to catch the real criminal, allowing him to strike again. About 3 months after Rachel Nichol's death, Robert was arrested, but for a completely different reason. He had tried to print copies of police documents on the right to own weapons. Later, the police detained him again after receiving a report from local residents about a stranger who had been looking into their windows. A search was conducted in Napper's apartment in Plumstead. The police found weapons, including pistols and knives. Also, in a red metal toolbox, a geographical map with markings was found. Napper had circled with a marker the places where he had committed attacks and raped his victims. The map was a trophy for him and a reminder of his brutal crimes. However, the police again failed to establish a connection between the cases. Robert was given an 8-week prison sentence for possession of a firearm. After that, he was released, although the court psychiatrist expressed the opinion that Napper posed an immediate threat to himself and society. Everything went unpunished for Robert. First the countless attacks on women on the Green Chain, and now the murder of Rachel Nichol. After being released from prison following the 8-week sentence, Napper continued to commit his crimes. This time, he again chose a mother with a child as his victim. For some time, Robert had been watching their house. 27-year-old Samantha Bisset and her 4-year-old daughter Jasmine lived in Plumstead. Samantha's partner Conrad said that one night they had indeed noticed a man on the street looking into the windows. Napper was simply waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. This opportunity presented itself in November 1993, when Conrad went to spend the night at his father's house, and Samantha and her daughter stayed home. Breaking into the apartment by deception, Robert stabbed the woman several times in the chest and neck with a knife, and then subjected her to sexual violence. The attack was brutal. Samantha's body was mutilated. The criminal, as the subsequent autopsy showed, took part of the victim's stomach wall with him as a trophy. But that was not the worst part, because after killing the mother, Robert made his way into Jasmine's room, sexually assaulted her, and then suffocated her. The victims' bodies were discovered the next morning by Samantha's partner. According to available data, the crime scene was so horrific that the police photographer assigned to take pictures in Samantha Bisset's apartment had to take long-term leave after what he saw. Detectives examined the fingerprints in the rooms and established that they all belonged to the people who lived in the apartment. Most likely, the attacker had been wearing gloves, but after re-examining the evidence, one more fingerprint was found. A check against the police database showed that it belonged to Napper. Also, in Samantha's house, a bloody footprint was noticed that matched Robert's shoes, and a witness was found who had seen a man in the area on the day of the crime. Robert Napper was finally arrested, and in May 1994, he was charged with the attack on Samantha Bissay and her daughter Jasmine. The detectives also considered the possibility that this person could be involved in the series of attacks on women on the Green Chain. The map found in Napper's bedroom, where the attack locations were circled, eventually played its role. It was believed that Robert had committed about 100 sexual assaults, but only 2 attacks and 2 attempts could be proven. It turned out that during the investigation of the Green Chain crimes, Napper had been excluded from the list of suspects because of his height of 188 centimeters. According to the victims' descriptions, the rapist was short, and Robert was remembered as such because he often walked hunched over. In late 1995, Napper was found guilty of the manslaughter of Samantha and Jasmine Bissay on the grounds of diminished responsibility. He was sent to Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital for an indefinite period, and only in 2004 was the DNA sample from the body of the deceased Rachel Nikhil entered into the database. It matched Napper's DNA, who was already being held in a secure facility. This was not the only evidence linking Robert to the attack on Rachel. When detectives searched his belongings, they found a red metal box under the bed containing knives and a map of the area. The map marked the locations of the attacks, including Wimbledon Common, where Rachel had been killed. Little Alex, who had become the only witness to the crime, had traces of red paint left in his hair, the origin of which could not be established. It turned out that it matched the paint on the box where Napper kept his tools. More than 16 years later, justice was restored, and the victim's family was able to achieve justice. Robert Napper was found guilty of the murder of Rachel Nikhil. However, this case revealed numerous mistakes by the Metropolitan Police, who failed to detain the criminal even when his own mother reported the first attack on a woman in the house. It was this that led to the tragic consequences, and the police offered official apologies to the victims' families. Colin Stagg, who had been falsely accused of the murder and disgraced throughout the country because of his intimate fantasies, received compensation of more than £700,000. He spent 14 months in prison awaiting trial, and even after his acquittal, for many years, Colin Stagg was subjected to attacks from the authorities and the press. Everyone considered him an evil monster who had attacked a young mother with a child. The public hated him, and newspapers and other media constantly printed nasty things about him. The undercover law enforcement officer Lizzie James, who had been hired to extract a confession from Colin Stagg, later took early retirement and sued the Metropolitan Police. The lawsuit claimed that she had suffered serious psychological trauma as a result of the forced actions during Operation Edzell. In 2001, Lizzie received a payment of £125,000. This decision caused widespread criticism from the public. Many believed that the payment was unfair and did not correspond to the scale of the harm caused. The son of the deceased Rachel Nikhil, Alexander Louis Hanscom, and his father, Andre Hanscom, shared their memories in a book in which they talked about their life after the tragedy. Despite the dark thoughts of voluntary departure that had haunted Andre immediately after his wife's death, the man found the strength to live on, raised his son, and managed to maintain optimism. And the grown-up Alexander still keeps in his memory that terrible day that took his mother away from him forever. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video. On a spring morning in 1986, an employee of the Transamerica Corporation in an office in Arizona experienced a terrible feeling of déjà vu. While talking with colleagues in the break room, she smelled a strange aroma. The woman could not say exactly where the smell was coming from, but it was familiar to her and caused anxiety because the last time she had encountered it was under very frightening circumstances. The company employee became lost in her thoughts when suddenly cries came from the hallway. Colleagues who were seriously frightened were asking to urgently call 911. Although the woman did not understand what had happened, fear overcame her. It turned out that the events in the hallway and her memories were more closely connected than she could have imagined. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helped us a lot, thank you. March 24th, 1986, began for 46-year-old Julia Williams as an ordinary Monday. After waking up, she had breakfast, got ready, and headed to the Transamerica Corporation office in Tempe, Arizona. Transamerica was engaged in financial and insurance business, and Julia worked as a deposit secretary in a small branch specializing in home and commercial real estate insurance. Only a few people worked in the office, but this did not bother the woman. At that time, she had been working there for about 2 months and had gotten along excellently with her colleagues. Julia had moved to Arizona after her divorce and now lived with her daughter Nancy and son-in-law Mike in Mesa. She had spent most of her life in California, where she had gotten married and raised 3 children. The last couple of years had been difficult for Julia, and only recently had she begun to find solid ground under her feet. Work and attending church in Phoenix had helped her feel better. At work, Julia took care of her usual tasks, left her things on the desk, and went to the small office kitchen where her colleagues had gathered. On Monday, everyone was a little slow to start working. In the office break room, people were discussing their weekends, in no hurry to get down to business. Several employees were standing around the water cooler. When Julia entered the room, she wished everyone a good morning and poured herself a glass of water. After a few sips, a strange expression appeared on her face. She felt that the water had an unusual taste, and her lips and tongue felt as if they had been burned by flame. Julia warned her colleagues not to drink the water from the cooler and headed to the restroom herself. Despite this warning, 2 employees took cups and poured themselves some water. After taking a couple of sips each, the guy named Glenn and the woman named Deborah quickly realized that Julia was not joking. The water tasted so strange that they spat it out. No one paid much attention to the unusual incident in the kitchen. The employees decided to simply call the company that delivered drinking water and complain about the problem. Immediately, putting the situation out of their minds, they went to their workstations, but soon noticed that Julia still had not returned from the restroom. Deciding to check if she was okay, 2 employees went to the restroom and found the woman lying unconscious in one of the stalls. She was not responding to anything, and it became clear that something serious had happened. Soon, a couple of paramedics arrived at the scene, but by the time Julia was taken to the hospital, she had already fallen into a coma. Initially, the doctors assumed that she had suffered a massive stroke, but after a more thorough study of the symptoms and clarification of the circumstances of what had happened that morning, their opinion changed. Particular attention was drawn to the strange taste of the water in the office cooler. The police who arrived at the scene confirmed the doctors' worst fears. The water in the cooler contained cyanide, which, when dissolved in liquid, becomes transparent. In dry form, it has no odor, but when mixed with water, it can emit a slight almond aroma. The 2 other employees who also drank the water were not harmed because they did not manage to swallow a sufficient amount of the toxin. However, Julia, unfortunately, was not so lucky. Cyanide is a chemical substance that blocks the body's ability to use oxygen at the cellular level. This leads to a person beginning to suffocate from within, even if they technically continue to breathe. Symptoms of cyanide poisoning may include chest pain, dizziness, nausea, vomiting, and breathing problems. There is an antidote that can help in case of poisoning, but its effectiveness depends on how quickly it is taken. Unfortunately, in Julia's case, she was taken to the hospital when catastrophic and irreversible brain damage had already begun as a result of cyanide poisoning. She remained in a coma for 2 days before her daughter made the decision to disconnect her mother from life support. But the story did not end there. It turned out that the cyanide poisoning was not accidental. Potassium cyanide, although a naturally occurring chemical substance, is usually not found in such quantities in office water coolers. The police discovered that the toxin was not only in the cooler, but also in other items in the office kitchen, including milk, cream, mugs, and the coffee pot. This ruled out suspicions against the water delivery company, since the source of contamination was present in different places. Analysis results showed that the amount of cyanide was enough to poison at least 150 people. This caused alarm and suspicion of intentional crime, and whoever was behind it seemed not to have thought about the number of victims. The memory of the infamous crimes involving Tylenol in Chicago was still fresh in the public mind when 7 people died as a result of poisoning products with this drug. Only 4 years had passed since the tragedy, and fears about product tampering had not yet been forgotten. Naturally, cyanide in a small branch of the corporation raised many questions. Who would want to poison the company's employees, and for what reason? Were all employees the targets, or had someone harbored a grudge against a specific person? And the answers to these questions, strangely enough, were helped by one of the office employees in Arizona, Diana Harry. Julia Williams was indeed one of the victims of the poisoning, so investigators considered the possibility that she might have been the intended target. However, it soon became clear that there was no evidence of this. The woman had no sworn enemies, and she led a quiet, calm life surrounded by family. In addition, she was a new employee in the office and got along well with everyone, which made the version unlikely. The possibility was also considered that all employees of the Transamerica Corporation could have become targets, but the police had received no other reports. The situation looked extremely confusing and unclear. Everything changed when detectives spoke with other employees of the branch. One of them, Diana Harry, told a disturbing story. Diana was 29 years old, and she had worked at Transamerica for about 2 years. The woman explained that on the morning of the crime, she was in the break room with other colleagues when she smelled a strange odor. At first, she could not understand where it was coming from, and this caused her concern. Harry was sure that she recognized this smell, and that the last time she had encountered it was under extremely unpleasant circumstances. 3 days before the incident at the office, on Friday, March 21st, Diana was relaxing at home after work and decided to drink a little whiskey to unwind. Pouring herself a glass of alcohol and taking a sip, she felt that something was wrong. The whiskey tasted disgusting and had an unpleasant smell. The woman immediately set the glass of alcohol aside and complained about the taste of the drink to her husband, 32-year-old Louis Harry Jr., who had just returned from work. Louis also tried the whiskey and immediately spat it out, just like the other employees who later tried the poisoned water from the cooler. Diana said that during the incident, she felt ill, became dizzy, started feeling nauseous, and could not breathe. Going outside to get some fresh air, she momentarily felt better, but when she returned to the house, she lost consciousness. Fortunately, her fainting spell was brief, but she spent the entire weekend in bed. Initially, the woman thought the cause was poor quality alcohol, but after the incident with Julia Williams at the office, she changed her mind. What worried Diana most was the smell she had sensed in the office. The water cooler, like the whiskey, emitted the aroma of bitter almonds, a characteristic sign of the presence of cyanide. The police confiscated the bottle of whiskey from Diana's home, and it turned out that it also contained potassium cyanide, but in a smaller amount than in the cooler. If Diana had drunk more that evening, she would probably have died. Thus, it turned out that someone had twice unsuccessfully tried to poison Diana Harry, but who and for what reason could have wished her death? The first attempt was made in her own home, which immediately caused detectives to suspect her husband, Louis Harry Jr. However, Diana was sure that her husband would never harm her. She claimed that she and Louis had met about 5 years earlier at a volleyball match and were still in love with each other, and that both of them were united by an active lifestyle. Louis's entire existence revolved around sports. He played tennis, volunteered as a referee for basketball games at the local church and youth clubs. Even his job was related to sports. Louis worked as equipment manager in the physical education department at South Mountain Community College in Phoenix. Diana and Louis had been married for 3 years, and during that time, they had never had serious problems. The woman did not believe that her husband was capable of a crime. In addition, her husband had also tried the poisoned whiskey. Why would he do that if he knew about the poison? Moreover, it was Louis who insisted on checking the poor quality alcohol when Diana told him about the incident. She had thrown the bottle in the trash the day after she felt ill, but Louis pulled it out and put it away because he had his own suspicions. Then, Diana made another shocking admission. The woman told the police that for the last several weeks, she and her husband had been receiving threats from one person. It had all started a couple of months earlier when Louis, unknowingly, had gotten into an unpleasant situation. He had met and become friends with a woman named Verbania Wooten. Verbania told him about the terrible ordeal she had gone through with her ex-boyfriend, 43-year-old delivery driver named Roy Fitzpatrick. Verbania and Roy had dated for about 3 weeks, but that was enough time for her to realize that they were not right for each other. When the woman tried to end the relationship, Roy turned into a complete psycho. He began stalking her, attacked her several times, and threatened violence, unwilling to accept the breakup. And this had been going on for a long period of time. Lewis advised Verbania to take Roy to court and even offered to go with her if she was afraid to go alone. The woman hesitated at first, but then decided to follow her friend's advice. Everything went well for her. She obtained a court order of protection against her ex-boyfriend and was able to get rid of the harassment. However, this decision led to unpleasant consequences for Lewis and Diana. Roy was furious about the restraining order, and since he continued to watch Verbania, he quickly learned of Lewis's involvement and directed all his anger at him and Diana. Over the past month, the hairy couple had received 7 letters from Roy Fitzpatrick in the mail. Some of them were addressed to Diana and some to Lewis. All the messages were aggressive, full of insults, and contained threats. The last letter the couple received before the incident at the office was especially ominous. It said that Roy was not going to give Lewis 2 women at once, and that he would have to get rid of one of them or send Lewis himself to the other world. Diana told the detectives that the letter they received had frightened her and her husband so much that they decided to prepare for self-defense. Lewis bought her a 9mm pistol and took her to shooting practice so that she could protect herself in case of an attack. This gave them a sense of security because the couple believed that Roy would attack them openly, but they were wrong. When the detectives spoke with Lewis Harry Jr., he told the same story as Diana, and in confirmation of his words, he handed over all of Roy Fitzpatrick's threatening letters. The authorities also spoke with Verbania Wooten, who stated that her ex-boyfriend was definitely capable of such actions. Over the past 5 years, he had turned her life into hell, and there was no line he would not cross just to gain control over her. With each new piece of evidence against Roy, his position became increasingly shaky. When the police contacted Fitzpatrick and offered to talk, he initially refused, but a day later he called back and agreed to answer questions. Roy did not deny sending the threatening letters to Lewis and Diana, but he continued to claim that he was innocent and that he had his own story that he wanted to share. Fitzpatrick stated that he had a grudge against Lewis, not because of the restraining order, but because he was having an affair with his ex-girlfriend Verbania. One day, he had followed Lewis and learned that he was married. This angered Roy, and he began sending him threatening letters. However, the man claimed that he was not involved in the poisonings or the murder. To the detectives' surprise, Verbania confirmed that she and Harry Jr. had been in a romantic relationship, but she believed that Lewis and Diana were getting a divorce. The lovers had even become engaged and were simply waiting for the divorce process to be completed. This was completely new information for the police, since neither Diana nor Lewis had mentioned a divorce. However, there was another detail that made them reconsider the course of the investigation. Returning to the conversations with Roy, the detectives showed him the letters seized from the Harry couple. As mentioned earlier, Lewis and Diana had received a total of 7 letters, but only the first 4 messages were handwritten. The last 3, the most threatening ones, were typed on a typewriter. Roy admitted to writing the first 4 letters, but claimed he had nothing to do with the other 3. Of course, this caused confusion among the detectives, who no longer knew whom to believe. However, one thing they knew for sure: they needed real evidence, and soon an incredible opportunity arose that finally helped unravel this unusual case. The day after the poisoning at the corporation branch, on March 25, 1986, the police conducted a search. The search took place in another office that had no connection to the Transamerica branch. But as soon as the investigators entered, it became clear that the crime had been planned right there. In addition to traces of potassium cyanide, on the detective's shelf, they found several notebooks on the desk in which fragments of the last 3 letters sent to the Harry couple had been written. It looked as if someone had been practicing composing the text in draft form before typing it on a typewriter. However, The most important evidence was 2 crumpled sheets of paper thrown into the trash can. They were a receipt and an information bulletin from the company listing the rules for handling chemicals and the rules for their use in scientific purposes. The receipt contained an order for 450 grams of potassium cyanide, dated March 7th. That is, the poison had been purchased just a couple of weeks before the poisoning at the office. Although the receipt was signed with the name Charles Hawley, the police considered this name fictitious because of where the office was located and to whom it belonged. The office was located on the campus of South Mountain Community College and belonged to Louis Harry Jr. The investigators invited a handwriting expert to analyze the signature on the receipt and compare it with the signature of Diana's husband. The expert confirmed that the signature on the receipt belonged to Louis. The representative of the chemical company who handled the transaction not only recognized Louis from the photograph, but also stated that Harry Jr. had used the South Mountain Community College account to make the purchase. And this was easy to trace, since the college sometimes purchased various chemicals for laboratories, but potassium cyanide had never been stored on the campus grounds. Another incredible way the police linked Louis to the crime was the envelope used to send one of the typewritten threatening letters. The envelope had a manufacturing defect. When the investigators searched Louis's office, they found a box with exactly the same defective envelopes. This was clear evidence that all the envelopes belonged to the same batch of goods. Despite the collected evidence, one important question remained. It had been easy for Louis to poison his wife Diana the first time when she drank the spoiled whiskey, but how had he gotten into the Transamerica office? The branch was located in a new office park with good security. The building was locked on weekends, and access was only possible with a key card. Security system records showed that Diana Harry's key card had been used on March 22nd at 10:18 a.m. This happened on Saturday, the day before Julia Williams' death. It turned out that contractors had been working in one of the units that same day. No one had seen a woman entering the complex, but one of the workers had noticed a man waiting outside to be let onto the construction site. The man had appeared at exactly the time when Diana's card was being used. The worker could not identify Louis from photographs, but he described his car, a blue sports car with a tennis racket in the rear window. After comparing all the evidence, the investigators concluded that Louis Harry Jr. had entered Diana's office using a stolen key card. In January 1986, he had met Verbinia Wooten at a club, and they had begun an affair. Louis had lied to his mistress and said that his relationship with his wife was on the verge of divorce, although he had not originally planned to leave Diana. He was unhappy in his marriage, but Diana earned more and thereby provided them with a decent standard of living. Louis's scheme worked until Verbinia's crazy ex-boyfriend, Roy Fitzpatrick, learned about the affair and began blackmailing Harry with threatening letters. Although most people would have considered this a bad act, Louis saw an opportunity to get everything he wanted, to send his tiresome wife to the other world and frame Roy so that he could then calmly start a new life with Verbinia. To achieve the result, Louis typed several threatening letters on a typewriter and sent them to himself, presenting everything as if Roy was the author. At the same time, he purchased a large amount of potassium cyanide under a fictitious name, believing that he could not be traced. On March 21st, Louis poisoned a bottle of whiskey at home, which contained the poison, knowing that Diana would definitely pour herself a glass to relax. However, everything did not go according to plan. The woman took a small sip and immediately sensed something was wrong. Her husband deliberately kept the bottle of alcohol so that he could later blame Roy. And so that his wife would not suspect anything, he also took a sip of the whiskey, but tried not to swallow a single drop. While Diana was outside recovering from the effects of the cyanide, Louis was in the bathroom, vigorously rinsing his mouth with water and brushing his teeth to protect himself. The next morning, when Diana still felt ill, the man took advantage of her poor condition and stole the office key card. Arriving at the building, he used the key to get inside the branch itself and poisoned the water in the cooler. Louis did not want his wife to get off with a light scare again, so he poured cyanide not only into the water, but also into other products in the refrigerator, perfectly understanding that several innocent people could be harmed. when once again everything did not go as Lewis had planned, and Diana survived a second attempt on her life. He had to do everything possible to pin the crime on Roy Fitzpatrick. But why didn't Lewis simply get a divorce if he wanted to be with Verbinia? The authorities suggested that the crime was at least partly related to money. Diana Harry had life insurance policies for $75,000 and $32,000, as well as an additional $5,000 in company stock. If she had died, all that money would have gone to Lewis. It should not be forgotten that this was 1986, so the sum of $112,000 was not small. It was quite enough to start a new life with his mistress. After all the evidence came together, Lewis Harry was arrested and charged with first-degree felony crime. The most surprising thing was that after his arrest, the man ironically stated that he had been framed and that he was actually innocent. And both women, Diana and Verbinia, believed him, staying with Lewis even after the details of the police investigation became known. Diana not only paid for her husband's legal defense until she ran out of money, but also published a nearly half-page article in the Arizona Republic newspaper in which she outlined all the reasons why she considered her husband innocent. When the case went to trial in the fall of 1986, Diana and Verbinia, sitting next to each other, testified in Lewis's defense. They stated that they did not believe in his guilt and considered Roy Fitzpatrick to be the real criminal. This statement sounded even more shocking considering that Lewis himself admitted in court that he had regularly cheated on Diana. During their 3-year marriage, this was not his first affair on the side. But unfortunately for Lewis, although he may have managed to fool his 2 women, he failed to justify himself before the judge. The evidence against him continued to accumulate. Investigators found his fingerprints on several poisoned items in the Transamerica office. And during the search of Diana's house, they discovered 2 cigar tubes filled with potassium cyanide. In addition, Lewis's colleague, Robert Telenick, gave incriminating testimony. Robert worked as a lab technician at South Mountain Community College. He said that about 3 weeks before the poisonings, Harry Jr. had asked him for information about cyanide. He inquired where it could be bought and how much poison was needed to kill a person. Lewis himself claimed that the information was needed for his friend, who was investigating the Tylenol poisonings in Chicago. At the trial, Lewis continued to stick to his version, claiming that everything had been set up against him and that there were reasonable explanations for each of the charges. For example, he stated that his fingerprints ended up in Diana's office because she had called him that morning, complaining about the strange smell, and he had come to her workplace to figure it out. Although Diana had indeed called Lewis, it is hard to imagine that he had been allowed into the office immediately after the tragic incident had occurred there. In the end, the jury rejected his explanations, and Lewis Harry Jr. was found guilty of the death of Julia Williams, guilty of the attempted murder of 2 other office employees who drank water from the cooler, but, fortunately, survived, and also guilty of 2 separate attempts on the life of his own wife. In February 1987, Lewis Harry Jr. was sentenced to life imprisonment and an additional 105 years in prison. This man knew that anyone who drank the poisoned water could die. His cold-blooded and well-thought-out plan testified to monstrous cruelty. Nevertheless, Harry Jr. never admitted his guilt, stating that it was difficult for him to feel remorse for something he had not done. He remained in prison until his death. Lewis died in June 2021 at the age of 68. The saddest thing about this case is not the betrayal and not the lies, although that is terrible. What is most striking is that the story of 46-year-old Julia Williams, the real victim of circumstances, gets lost among all this. Her life was destroyed by a man who cared only about his own selfish desires. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.